Does this work, Lucas? Okay. Okay, we're at 1:30. Should we give it a minute or should we kick it off? All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our short course today on sustainability analysis on capturing life cycle costs and impacts in defense acquisition. Wanted to start by thanking our sponsor for this event, Dr. John LaScala and the SERDP and ESTCP Weapons Systems and Platforms Program area. And we have a full agenda today. I'll start with a little introduction of myself. I'm Michael Bruckner with Noblus, and my background is as a life cycle assessor, and I have been working on life cycle assessment, life cycle costing, and use of those techniques in defense acquisitions for the last decade. Talk a little bit about our agenda today. We're going to start with Ms. Betty Kremens from the White House Council on Environmental Quality, who will give an overview of federal policy and direction in this space. And then we're going to transition to Mr. David Osceola, who will discuss Department of Defense policy and sustainability, what that means for DoD. Then we're going to transition to Dr. Shannon Lloyd, who will give an overview of what life cycle assessment is and how it's used, what questions you can answer. At that point, we'll have a brief panel discussion where all of you will be able to ask questions to the speakers, and the idea is that this will be an interactive format to spur discussion of the different presentations today. That will be the first half of the short course. After a short break, we'll come back to a description from Dr. Richard Boma, who's going to talk about an actual SERDP ESTCP project and the life cycle assessment they're doing to meet their sustainability requirements, followed by an interactive short course from Dr. Shannon Lloyd and myself. So that's, I think, the overview of what we're going to discuss today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ms. Betty Kremens, who is the Director for Sustainable Supply Chains at the White House Council for Environmental Quality. Prior to her time at CEQ, she came from the World Economic Forum and then previously almost a decade at the Carbon Disclosure Project, where she focused on greenhouse gas and climate disclosures as well as water disclosures and increasing those practices across supply chains. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Kremens.
Thank you so much. It's almost time for a break. That's okay. Okay, Great. Yeah, that break is going to come soon enough. So I don't have slides, but I'm excited to be here with you today. And if technology holds, my co-lead coming in from the great state of Seattle or in Washington, state of Washington and Seattle might be able to join us and share some remarks as well, because we are co-leads of a partnership of an incredibly ambitious scope of work. And hopefully I will help inspire all of you to be part of this because we cannot achieve it alone. So in his very first week in office, President Biden charged all of us to take action and make sure the federal government and our supply chains are climate ready, efficient, and resilient. And we've been working to deliver on that ever since then. There have been at least two really critical executive orders that I would point you to that have tasked us with this exact effort. One is Executive Order 14030, which looks at climate related financial risks. And the other is 14057, which put in place the most ambitious ever federal sustainability plan that challenges us to take our federal government, the way that we buy, build, and operate, and put it in service of our climate ambitions and actually get ahead of our global goals, our goals that we've submitted to the global framework, so that we're more resilient, more efficient, and more climate ready than the rest of our country. And we're setting ourselves on that path. And so if you live in this world, if you watch the news, if you live anywhere, you've already started to experience climate impacts. This is not a future issue. This is a today issue. We know there have been like $21 billion or greater storms over the past year. These costs just keep mounting. And we know as the federal government, we are the backstop, right? We have to be there to we have to be prepared, we have to be there to respond, and then we have to be there to help rebuild. And so we need to make sure that our installations and our operations and our supply chains, most importantly, are resilient and efficient and ready for these changes. So my colleagues and I in the Office of the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer think about this every single day. We have colleagues thinking about how we transition our fleet of 600,000 vehicles, both civilian and defense, towards zero emission vehicles. We have colleagues thinking about how we take our 300,000 buildings and make them net zero emissions, as well as running on 100% 24/7 carbon-free electricity everywhere that we operate across the country. We have colleagues thinking about how we build adaptation and resiliency into our operations and supply chains. And then Katie and I think about our $630 billion of spend and how we help work with our acquisition workforce within government, as well as our contracting community, to transition that spend towards net zero emissions procurement by 2050. So I'm going to share a little bit more about what we're working on in that portfolio and how you can be part of that ambition. So when we think about our spend, we're sort of categorizing it into three areas. We think about what we buy, who we buy from, and how we buy. And we're thinking about specific directives that we can put in place to transition in each of those areas. So when we think about what we buy, those are the products and services. I mentioned we're the largest buyer of these things. We have decades of experience thinking about Energy Star products that are more efficient and bio-preferred and recycled content and a lot of these criteria. And now as we look, we have things like PFAS that are on our radar and other environmental and social issues that we need to be considering in these products. So we have an ongoing work stream in support with the FAR Council, the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council, co-chaired by DoD, NASA, and GSA, where we're thinking about Section 23 of the FAR, if you're deep in the weeds on that, and thinking about all the ways that the federal government procures goods and services and how we ensure that we can spur markets for more efficient products. And so a lot of life cycle analysis and life cycle and total cost of ownership thinking goes into that work. And it's a really important work stream underway. The second part is who we buy from. These are our strategic partners in our contracting community, our contractors and their subcontractors. And we've been tasked by the executive order to ask that those companies do three things. One is to report greenhouse gas emissions across their footprints and their own supply chains. Two is to report climate-related financial risks, so we understand where their resiliency investments are and where their risks lie. And the third is to get them to set science-based targets to be reducing their emissions alongside the Paris Agreement. We have done as directed by the executive order, so you'll have seen a proposed FAR case, a proposed amendment to the FAR, I should say, about 2 weeks ago. It was announced at the climate conference in Egypt by the president. And I encourage you to go to regulations.gov to submit public comment and sustainability.gov to learn more about it. We have the proposed FAR amendment case open for major federal suppliers and we'll be looking to implement in the coming year. And then the third work stream is how we buy. This is our side. This is the acquisition workforce, the way that we do acquisition planning, the way that we do contracting, and making sure that we're thinking about minimizing the risks of climate through our power of acquisition. So this is both reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the timeframe that the climate science demands, as well as building that resiliency into our procurement so that we're increasing our adaptation resiliency from the impacts of climate, and we're able to continue to procure the goods and services we need. So there's already incredible amounts of pilots underway, many of them led by the departments, and many
someone else have a question?
But I think it's a great question. And sometimes a lot of the things we work on in economics are considered externalities because they don't have a price tag on it, but we know that they have a cost to them. So a lot of it is how we integrate financial pricing with impacts and looking at current, but also future impacts and the tools we have to look at that.
I'd like to talk about kind of the who, what, how of procurement. I like that a lot. When you mentioned what for the who are these companies who want them to report on greenhouse gas emissions. And I wonder if you could suggest, or was there going to be some sort of framework for those companies that have a cage code or buying or selling to the Department of Defense, if they're going to really have to do some reporting. A lot of those companies are not like the Fortune 500s that are sinking tons of millions of dollars into GRI reporting and stuff like that. So is there a framework that's kind of not?
Yeah, so I can't comment on the proposed case because it is open for public comment. So I would encourage you to read it, regulations.gov, and submit public comments if things are unclear or you want to learn more or you like things you see or have other suggestions. What I will say is that as we thought about the rule and proposed the rule, we did a lot of benchmarking against best practice or common practice in the private sector. We also looked at what the SEC is proposing for publicly traded companies. We looked at what our European and Canadian friends are doing, what the Japanese are doing. We did a broad approach to understand sort of what the common, I wouldn't even say best practice, the common practice, the sort of table stakes of this work. So the rule as proposed references 4 standards that are all outside of government that are international nonprofit standards that companies around the world are already using. So it looks at the greenhouse gas protocol for accounting for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. It looks at TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Rolls off the tongue, which is a framework for how companies are assessing their climate-related financial risk, both their transition risk on greenhouse gases, as well as their physical risk from extreme weather events and other physical changes from climate. The third acronym is the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a framework for how companies can follow sector-specific pathways to decarbonize and have their target to reduce certified by a third party that shows they're sort of doing enough for the global carbon budget, sort of doing their part towards the global ambition. And then the fourth acronym is CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, as mentioned, my former employer for many years, which is the international standard for how companies disclose their data. And that's about 18,000 companies are already using that standard. And the federal government has already been inviting our suppliers to do that since 2015. And so this is a proposal to mandate that and require public disclosure through that. So those are the 4 frameworks we looked at, but as it's open for public comment, encourage comments on those and others. And I will just say those apply to public and private companies of all sizes and internationally headquartered companies all over the world. So we were very specific in choosing things that were not just American based and not just for the largest companies. We understand we have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and very diverse businesses in our supply chain. We want to make sure it's applicable to all.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one more question before we move to the next session. Does anyone else have a question for Ms. Clemens?
Now we'll have a panel session after.
I'll be excited for the panel session. You should all pay a lot of attention, but in your free time, you should go to sustainability.gov and view the federal sustainability plan, as well as implementing instructions that have been put out that help every agency understand how to implement on the goals we've put out, and more information on the proposed FAR case that I've commented on, as well as the other 2 that are well underway towards our net zero emissions procurement goal. So please continue to pay attention. Looking forward to your future. Sure.
So one of the things I struggle with in life cycle analyses is to borrow the phrase, the unknown unknowns. And that is really endemic of the current crisis we're facing with PFAS. Is there a consideration, or how do we consider persistent bioaccumulative compounds as part of the supply chain? And the alternative analysis that goes into, this is a critical material. We don't have an alternative to informing trade-off. Maybe we don't use it as liberally as we might, given the properties these things are problematic. I'm just struggling with how we do a reasonable job of trying to accommodate that within an LCA.
I think it's a valid question. Flippantly, I often list like sort of unknown unknowns as sort of like job security. That's why people like us, are in this. And if we knew what we were doing, we would have just done it. So I find that to be the exciting part, is the innovation that goes into this. So I'm sure Dave has other ideas. He's like, no, I've solved this when I have moved along. So I would say, you said, how do we consider it? We consider it. I think that's a huge step for a lot of these things. I think to date, there's a lot of issues that we just haven't considered. And as the largest buyer in the world, we haven't had any price differentiation. We haven't sent any signals. So a lot of us work on another initiative called Buy Clean to decarbonize construction materials. To date, there's been no product differentiation for the greener cement or the really, really polluting cement. And so the fact that we're even like starting to think about it and consider it sends ripple effects through the economy. Then as we start to sort of set that 20% reduction, and we can ratchet it, and then the new innovative technologies drop in price, we can put some investment in, and then we can sort of close the gap. So I don't have an answer for you other than to say, consider it, tell folks you're considering it, and then continue to consider it in more increasingly structured ways and ensure there's data backing up the decisions. Because I spent my whole career working on what gets measured gets managed. And I think transparency and accountability of those measurements really drives a lot of action. So both inside and outside of government. So these guys have the tools. I just have the inspiration.
I can comment on that tools question specifically. Is SERDP and ESTCP weapon systems and platform area has actually invested in research to increase resolution of the modeling techniques that would be applicable for PFAS, in particular related to ecotoxicity and fading transport, which are the drivers for that ecosystem quality impacts of PFAS. So that the PFAS question is difficult because there's a whole family of chemicals where we don't understand the end of life, what happens with these chemicals. But SERDP ESTCP has been investing in research there. So that
I'm thinking I'm using PFAS as an example, but there's probably the next emergent contaminant that we haven't thought of that's playing out there. Somehow we can be able to accommodate that within the
I think it's even broader than that. Just like so it's even broader than that. It's like the unknowns, but it's the knowns that aren't listened to in some cases, that we might know about this stuff, yet we can't get the message to those decision makers that can and convince them that it's time to move on. We knew about perchlorate a long time before it was a problem. We knew about PFAS a long time before it was a problem. We had a lot of, it's just, we got to get that message into the weapon systems acquisition community, procurement communities, and the contracting communities, to have them understand that these changes, we don't make them now, are going to be very problematic. So the unknowns are problematic. The knowns that aren't being addressed are also.
Again, job security, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
all right, thank you,
Thank
Betty.
you
We'll
so
have a
much.
panel session, so there will be time for additional questions. We're Dave, just 1 second, we'll pull up your briefing.
Katie, come.
Oh, that's do we want to try? Katie, do you want to try one more time to see? You got to talk about the mic.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I like booming? I can't see you all, so I imagine it's like the voice coming from all directions. Betty, can you hear me?
You can go for it, Katie.
Well, I don't, the audio did cut out for a while, so I don't want to repeat anything that Betty already shared. Betty, could you let me know?
Yes.
You already shared my talking points, is that right? Sorry.
No, she will let you know if you say anything that she's already covered.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for having us today. And Betty shared kind of overarching explanation and a lot of our work with many agency partners. One thing I did want to highlight was that several months ago, when I learned about the sustainability analysis guidance document that will be covered in more detail during today's short course, I was excited to know that this is something that many of you have been thinking about for many years, up to 10 years, and that the life cycle approach is very critical, kind of related to that question right now that someone just made, is like to think about those different impacts, the known impacts, carbon, climate, environmental impacts. And in today's course, I know people will be talking about the life cycle of missions and how this can apply to your work. One thing I did want to mention is that the how we buy part of what Betty talked about and the FAR case around minimizing the risk of climate change and procurement. In parallel, we're aiming to identify and amplify pilots and pathfinders happening across the federal government. So if any of you are working on something related to life cycle assessment and the sustainability analysis, supply chain risk, et cetera, please get in touch either with me or Betty, because we would love to include your efforts in that amplification. So that's what I wanted to mention. Betty, anything else to tie back?
Let's move on to David, one of the true experts in this space.
Great, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Newhouse. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. David Osceola. Mr. Osceola is the Director for Sustainability and Acquisition at the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations, and Environment. Mr. Osceola manages several things in his portfolio, including the department's sustainability plan, ESOH in acquisition, environmental technology programs, and greenhouse gas reporting, amongst others. And with that, I'll invite Mr. Osceola up for his remarks.
So we had a short break for lunch, and there's a Mexican place just down the, if you go on the underground, it's not closed off, and the salsa was amazing, but it was really spicy and it went down my throat. So I've been coughing a little bit. It's not good. It's just the salsa, or it was the margarita. I don't remember which, but either one, it's fine. So yeah, like Michael said, I'm Dave Osceola, and I really appreciate you being here. And first and foremost, I've been a fan and a participant in the SERDP ESTCP program for 20 plus years now, and it's one of the best programs I've ever been part of. And it's a testament to the leadership of the program, but it's really more of a testament to these folks, you folks in here in the audience that do that kind of stuff for us day to day. And it's a passion of mine. So I just want to thank you. And I also want to thank Betty and Katie and the rest of the CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality Organization, because we have a really strong partnership. The Department of Defense, for the first time, I've been working for OSD for 22 years, I guess. It's a long time. For the first time that I can recall, our relationship with the White House is stronger than ever. And, it's not, if you think about the National Defense Strategy and one of the 3 lines of effort that the Secretary puts out there is partnerships. Partnerships is key and critical. And without that ability to coordinate and communicate with the White House, even with our friends on the Hill and others, it wouldn't be the success it's going to be, is now, and will be in the future. So I just want to thank you guys for all that. And I think our bosses really appreciate it. So I've got a boss, Richard Kidd. Some of you might have saw him at the keynote remarks, and he's always been counseling us about, you only have you got a half-hour time to talk in a meeting in the Pentagon, but you really only maybe get 5 minutes. So you got to tell them up front what you want to tell them. So my team said, hey, before you start talking, just tell them this. Tell them what's the key takeaways that I want to leave you with today. First one is sustainability is a priority for the Department of Defense. It's important for advancing the mission. If you haven't read the National Defense Strategy or even the National Security Strategy, which we built the National Defense Strategy on, that you'll see climate and sustainability as part of that. We recognize that Secretary all the way down, Secretary of Defense all the way down, recognizes that it's a real imperative that we get ahead of this, or at least don't let it get further behind us. If we do, we're not going to be able to do our jobs, defend the nation, defend and protect our people in uniform and the artisans and others that support it. Sustainability is an important element of acquisition policy, which includes the research, development, test, and evaluation community. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but sustainability isn't really a program. It's sort of a concept that needs to be integrated throughout all business elements, whatever organization we're part of. I mean, some of the leaders and captains of industry, you see some of their sustainability reports and plans are amazing. And it doesn't start with, oh, there's an office on sustainability. There may be a chief sustainability officer or something like that, but it's integrated throughout an organizational structure. And the Department of Defense really shouldn't be any different than that. we need to make sure we're integrated. And the last thing, and then this is probably from Michael, SERDP and ESTCP weapon systems and platform requires new sustainability analysis. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's a sustainability analysis guide, which looks at like life cycle, looks at total cost of ownership, looks at a variety of things, but it's something that over time, weapon systems and platforms thrust area have looked at projects that are going to be introduced to the department potentially as using this as a way to help advance what that project might be for the future. So those are the three takeaways. So if I fall over from the margarita, that's it. All right. So which button, Michael? Oh, this one.
Looking backwards.
All right, so this is sustainability in a nutshell. This vision you see out at the bottom, that's not new. Actually, Ash Carter, when he was a Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, this is the vision we've had since 2009. It's to maintain the ability to operate in the future without decline, either in the mission or in the natural and man-made, that's key element, systems that support it. So we're talking not just about the air, the water, the land, the energy that we need to do our jobs. We're actually also talking about those systems. In our case, acquisition systems mean weapon systems and platforms. And if you're not familiar with the Department of Defense's vernacular, procurement tends to focus around goods and services, consumables and other things that we buy. We have a huge spend there. Acquisition, we tend to talk about weapon systems and platforms, the military equipment and tactical systems that are longer term in nature. And Betty mentioned that sometimes it takes years to get these systems out there. We have different processes now that help expedite that. But we look at this, so we need both the natural and the man-made systems to be successful. So Betty alluded to a couple executive orders. One is the 14057, which is around primarily sustainability initiatives. And there's a bunch of activities we currently have ongoing, and a lot of them are based around installations, but we have other activities, and we're going to move into that in a little bit. But first of all, greenhouse gas reduction planning. So we've had a very, very strong adaptation policy in place. So that means like, all right, let's say the climate's not going to get much better, and we're going to have all these issues associated with climate, whether they're weather events or sea level rise or whatever the case might be, wildfires, which is a big deal now. How can we adapt? Where should we base our installations? Are those installations so critical that we're going to have to reinforce them to some degree, or do we walk away? Do we figure out a different way to handle that? How do we adapt? But we have not yet. We are starting to go down this path, be a world team player in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what a lot of the sort of ESTCP technologies are doing. They're helping us figure out, there's adaptation, absolutely, but they're also figuring out what alternatives can we put in place to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. We also are in the process of, and some of you in the audience might know about this, there's an RFP, tell me if I'm wrong, Carrie, but an RFP out there that has been released that is going to look for a strategic partner that help the Department of Defense figure out where we should be investing, what we should be doing in greenhouse gas reductions, and a variety of other things around sustainability. That's a big deal for the department. It's sort of like a best in class sort of activity. And it's not going to be a consultant, it's going to be a partner. So we're going to be hand in hand with a group of folks, maybe a conglomerate, most likely, to help the department do this. The White House has asked every agency to have several plans in place. One is a carbon pollution-free electricity plan, and we're implementing pilot projects now, and we're developing a CFE strategic plan. There's a net zero installations plan. It's really called a net zero buildings plan, but for the department with the, I don't know how many thousands of buildings we have, it's not really feasible. So we're doing a net zero installation so we can meet the goal. So that will be occurring. And then a variety of other things, a net or zero emissions vehicles plan, where the tricky part here is we get the ZEVs, we can buy the ZEVs, but where's the infrastructure, right? So we're working on developing the infrastructure and how we place and house that. Net zero procurement. So Betty already mentioned there's FAR cases out there, so I don't want to really elaborate on those too much, but those are going to help our providers, our suppliers understand that this is important. DoD has already gone out on record saying, look, we want to be, if we can have a product that is more carbon neutral or producing less carbon or any kind of greenhouse gas emissions, that's the product we want to procure. And so industry, please take note, that's where we're heading. Climate resilient infrastructure. I already mentioned the climate adaptation plan. And one thing that we touched on was environmental justice. And that's really tricky, and it's really important because, you know, our men and women in uniform and the artisans that support our military operations, a lot of times are in areas that aren't really, you know, maybe disserved. And we really can't have that happen. It's just not right, right? I mean, it's not right for anybody. So we need to do a better job with environmental justice. And there's a whole strategic activity going on to try to integrate all this stuff. Under sustainable acquisitions, though, so I mentioned there's this, I didn't really mention, an adaptive acquisition framework. So if you're familiar with weapon systems acquisition, we've had the traditional weapon systems where we build a aircraft carrier over 25, 30 years, right? We design, we kind of already know what that might be, but it's going to be the new modern carrier, or the aircraft might even be a better example because that technology changes a little bit more frequently. And, you know, you do all this design, build, and then field, operate, maintain, dispose. Well, adaptive acquisition framework will recognize that we can't get a technology to the field fast enough. The warfighters are suffering in the battlefield. They're not getting the technology they need. So they created urgent needs capabilities, which is 2 years or less, or rapid tier, rapid prototyping, which is 5 years for rapid prototyping, rapid fielding. I mean, those kinds of things are where we live in this space. But how do we do our, and this was in a morning session, we talked about a DESHI. If anyone was in the session when Noah Lieb talked about the DESHI, my question was, well, yeah, you know, sometimes the environmental safety and occupational health aspects are not necessarily recognized fast enough when we have to get a technology out there. So we're still wrestling with that. But one of the things we are providing, and this is where the big part of this, I think, part of this courses today would be on the sustainability analysis guide, which gives a program, a weapon systems program manager or the whole team, from large scale programs, ACAP acquisition category 1, which are the high level, very, you know, big things like aircraft carriers and fighter jets, down to even 2, 3, and 4, an opportunity to understand what trade-offs can go into a design. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about why that's so important in a second. But we're going to talk about that more later, but that's kind of the key thing. And we're able to get that guide as part of our acquisition, defense acquisition series, the DoD 5000 series and the DoD 5000 defense acquisition guidebook. So that's all really kind of key to what we're doing from sustainability initiatives. But for this community, I think that's a foot stomp, I guess it would be, that analysis guide. And for the RDT&E community, that's really part of how projects can move forward. So I mentioned a bit ago that yes, sustainability is or needs to be, if it's not already, inherent in our acquisitions, weapon systems acquisitions. We talk about sustainable procurement a lot, but really within weapon systems, because for a while, there's a lot of exemptions that occur because it's really, really hard in some cases. So the White House has given the Department of Defense and other security agencies the opportunity to maybe exempt for mission critical needs certain weapon systems. This administration, even though we have that authority, has chosen at this point not to exempt weapon systems and platforms, you know, military equipment and tactical systems yet. Now, there may be that need in certain cases for certain things, but the going in approach is let's do what we can. Let's figure it out. So, you know, sustainability needs to be inherent, and it's not just in the production or in the design or the development, it's throughout the entire life cycle of the system, from, like I said, design through disposal. We need to understand that there is a way to do this. It's not perfect, but there's this analysis guide. If programs and program offices understand it and know how to use it, then we're much better, in a much better place. I think sometimes when I talk to folks, I'm sort of preaching to the choir, right? I was at a systems engineering conference. Those are the kind of kind of functions that we need to talk to, because we all kind of maybe get it in this audience, maybe, but systems engineering, where we make these changes, where they can actually design these problems out, they don't know about this stuff. So I ask all of you, and I'll try to be like, you know, happy and as Betty is when she's like really bubbly, but to do that, to talk to your folks, talk to the people that you work with, say, look, these tools exist. If you don't know about them, we'll be happy to share them with you. So the sustainability analysis guide really looks at including both internal life cycle costs in addition to often overlook the external costs. So what are those costs? Right now, we're looking at really, really modifying the guide to include greenhouse gas emissions. What are the costs? Social costs of carbon, we talked about. What are those costs? So we can put a monetary value on this, it's hard. I mean, there's a life value, there's a monetary value, there's all kinds of values that tend to resonate with certain communities like program offices that we are looking to do with this guide. So you may, if you're not within weapon systems acquisition, you may not really understand that, but if you are, you've seen this graph 1,000 times. I've seen it since I started my career a long time ago. I just got my 35-year pin this week. I don't know if you know that. It's a long time. But anyway, so it just kind of looks at total life cycle cost. So what happens here, and this is why the research and development community is so important, 20% in a life cycle of a weapon system, which can go on for 30 years in the traditional life cycle, all those costs, 90%, 80% of those costs are locked in the first 20% of that development. So if you understand, and the gentleman here talked about the unknown unknowns or unknown unknowns, if we happen to know one of these issues, we can try to design out it in the first part of the research and development. So an alternative that comes out from ESTCP and SERDP, we can make a huge difference in the end. And the funny thing is, sometimes you don't know what that difference is because you've designed out a problem, so you don't know what the benefits were. But when you don't design out a problem, you can see what those costs are, not just in monetary value, but in loss of life, because this is not just environment, it's safety, and it's occupational health, long-term health issues with the men and women that are using and maintaining and flying and sailing these systems. And so our goal, our job is to try to take this research and development community, inform the program acquisition community with solid data. We talked about data, about why and when and where we should be making these changes, and these are the benefits for them. And I think the sustainability analysis guide helps us in that regard. So I maybe just said that, but what the sustainability analysis can help you with, it builds awareness of the projects. I mean, we do have this thing called the Valley of Death, and everyone here in the room probably understands that. So we've been struggling with how we can avoid that. And so the implementers, the people that take these technologies and actually put them into play, need to understand why and how this can help them. It's designed to help programs succeed, and it delivers resources that makes it easier. I've learned over time, if it's hard to do, human nature is sometimes like, well, I have an easy way to do it. I know how to do it. I've been doing it for 30 years, 35, I guess, in my case. So why would I change? It works. Well, maybe there's a chance to make it easier and better in the future. And those are the kinds of organizations and people that we're trying to make understand this. For technology developers, it helps you with your statements of need, your broad agency announcements, and calls for proposal, because they ask you to do these things: develop a baseline lifecycle framework, identify elements of the life cycle inventory, and conduct preliminary assessment of cost and environmental impacts of your proposed research. And so this sustainability analysis guide actually can help you do that. It's not, it's been employed for a while, and I don't know. John, you and Robin, I think as you look forward, this is going to be hopefully more, kind of a big push for the technology, the assessors of these technologies. But I think this is going to be very helpful for the future. In summary, sustainability in general, so sustainability encompasses a whole variety of things. I could talk about energy, climate, chemicals, blah, blah, blah. It really is just, like I said, it's a sort of not an ethic, but sort of like a model that every organization should embrace, in my opinion. But the reasons why: it ensures resilience and it helps advance mission capabilities. It's in our national defense strategy. The Secretary wouldn't have signed that out, Secretary of Defense, if the department didn't believe this was a national security imperative. We help achieve the goals of partners with the federal sustainability activity. And it's not just DoD, right? It's the entire federal government. We're in the federal family. And it's not just the federal government, the states. We work with the states and the tribes and the NGOs and everybody. This partnership really kind of coming together pretty impressively. And data, it's data. We want to understand and know the data. So the science data that you guys work on, it can provide to the policymakers. And Mr. Kidd mentioned that at the plenary. It's the merging of policy and science coming together. And I think that's really what our sustainability initiatives try to do. It's critical for acquisition process. We have to have the availability of chemicals and materials. So we're finding, and if you were in any of the other sessions this morning about REACH or TSCA, both international and national, there's regulations that are really impacting us. So if we can get alternatives that do the job, right? We need them to do the job. It can't be just an alternative that just doesn't work. Then it's critical. And so the analysis guide will help us understand, does it not just do the job, but does it better? Is it cheaper? Is it what a trade-off might be? So, and going back to this, I'm sure there's no decline in natural and man-made systems. That kind of goes back to doing the job. So this is from the SecDef, the bottom box here. Secretary of Defense Austin said this at the Statement for Leaders for the Leaders Summit in Climate back in about a year ago in April. When we operate more sustainably, we become more logistically agile and ready to respond to crises. And so again, that's kind of the takeaway for all of us here. It's not just to be altruistic, which is nice, but it's because it's a mission imperative to actually integrate this. And I encourage you to listen to the Sustainability Analysis Guide and the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
With that, we're going to transition to Dr. Shannon Lloyd. Dr. Lloyd is a professor of business at Concordia University, where her research includes life cycle assessment, science-based targets, measurement of life cycle emissions, and she has spent decades also implementing these kinds of techniques in the defense sector. So we're really looking forward to Dr. Lloyd's presentation on life cycle assessment and how to use it.
We're still having Zoom problems. I feel that was the theme of my last 3 years. Teaching undergrads on Zoom was really exciting. No one spoke, you just saw names. And then my son, who was in 3rd grade, nobody would stop talking. And so we were sharing an office and I just watched his teacher in envy. Anyway, so thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. Just a little bit of background. So as Michael mentioned, prior to becoming a professor, I worked for about 10 years as a defense contractor on a variety of energy and environmental projects. My research background was in LCA. And so in a lot of those projects, LCA, life cycle assessment, in a lot of those projects, I used a life cycle assessment framework or other similar frameworks in that work. In 2016, I moved to Canada, became a professor. And now my work is really focused on trying to figure out how to make these frameworks, LCA, greenhouse accounting, and other frameworks more actionable so they can better support decisions. And my interest really is in supporting future decisions, not looking retrospectively at what have we done, where did we go wrong, but thinking about how can we do better in the future. And so as Michael mentioned, I've deviated a little bit from what he said I would do, but I will provide a quick background on what is this LCA, just the Cliff Notes background so that we're all on the same page. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the work I'm doing. The research in this area has just taken off tremendously in the last decade. And so there are researchers all over the world who are developing methods to improve LCA. And so I'll talk about a few that I'm familiar with, but if you have any questions, I could certainly talk about others. And I might need some help here on the movement. Nope, I've got it. Okay, so what is life cycle assessment? Usually we're interested in this thing, right? This thing that we're using, that's what we care about. And that thing comes with a lot of other things that took to get us this thing. And then we have to do something with it afterwards, right? We all see this with life cycle cost analysis. It's the same thing with life cycle assessments. We're looking at the full system, ideally. We know there are a lot of things that we need to make this happen. We need energy, we need water, we need chemicals, we need labor, we need investments. We need a lot of things. In LCA, we're focusing on the environmental aspect. And there are a lot of outcomes that aren't necessarily what we wanted. Really, what we wanted is this thing, right? All of these things happen because we wanted this thing. That's our product up here. But we get a lot of other things, right? Some of them are good things and some of them are not so much. And so in LCA, we try to look at those and try to understand what the impact of those are. Today, most LCAs look at this set of categories. We look at how did the inputs and outputs associated with that system impact resource availability? How do they impact climate change? How do they impact human health? And I want to pause here for a second, because with LCA, when we talk about human health, we're talking at human health impacts associated with pollutants that are released into the natural environment, but we don't look at the occupational setting. So that is one set of human health that are not captured by LCA. And then we also look at ecosystem quality. Okay, so that was the crash course for those of you who were not familiar with LCA. Now we'll talk about some of the areas that I'm involved with and that others are involved with as well in terms of advancing LCA. And so one is LCA of emerging technology. So LCA in practice is very retrospective. We're using data based on the things that we're doing right now. And so when we try to apply those to the future, we often use data that will be outdated when that technology is in use. And so there's a number of researchers. Well, there's been an increase in the amount of studies that have been done looking prospectively. And there's a really famous one that we use in our courses, a study of electric vehicles that was done about 20 years ago and assumed a very static world, right? And it made electric vehicles look really bad forever, right? And so that study was, in the news, it was one that, really was used to say that, no, we don't have a future of electric vehicles. It's not going to answer our problems, right? And so one of the things that a lot of researchers are doing now is trying to figure out, well, how do we use, econometrics and other tools to improve our LCA? How do we use AI to help us estimate what the emissions of different production processes might be in the future? And so there's been a number of studies that have come out recently that really try to develop a conceptual understanding of LCA of emerging technologies. What works? What doesn't work? What do we need to do to improve LCA so we can do a better job evaluating emerging technologies and enabling decision makers to make better decisions? The first one map that I've listed here, these are great studies if you're interested in LCA of emerging technology. It mapped the relationship between TRL and LCA challenges and potential. So depending on where you are, what your technology readiness is, what challenges will you face, and what types of decisions can you inform? The next study looked at all of the studies that have been done and developed guidance for conducting LCA of emerging technologies, again, based on TRL, but also market maturity. So we might have a new technology that's entering into an existing market space, or we might have a new technology that's entering into a market that might enter into a market space that we don't know, that doesn't exist yet. And so how does that influence the way in which you use LCA and how you need to do the LCA? And then a recent study, this one was one done by a student of mine and myself. We looked at these frameworks, we evaluated these frameworks. And one of the things that they tended to do was really focus on uncertainty, methodological challenges, and data challenges. And what we see from the practice is that real uncertainty and methodological challenges are related to TRL, absolutely. And so the way in which we approach the LCA needs to be modified depending on where you are with the technology readiness. One of the things that they seem to focus on is data challenges, and as if data challenges are much worse when you have a much less immature technology. And what we found is that data challenges persist regardless of TRL. And it's a fact that we just have to accept. And we'll get to that in another slide. And really the other thing that we wanted to emphasize is that there are so many LCAs that are done in a vacuum without ever talking to the technology developer and the end users. And this is a real problem. And so we really focused on the importance of engaging with key stakeholders in these studies and the value or lack of value depending on how much you did engage with those stakeholders. And then also scenario analysis. How many, those of you who have looked at LCAs, it's just mind blowing to look at an LCA and see one result. It's just this is not helpful. We really need to know what are the possible outcomes? Where's the important uncertainty? Where do we need to dig deeper? Okay, so another area that I'm working on, there's a group of researchers. Some of you may know Kelly Scanlon. Anybody know Kelly Scanlon? Okay, Scanlon started this mess, okay? Just remember that. So Kelly did her PhD, and I was one of her committee members then, and we worked very closely on this project to integrate occupational injuries, illnesses, and fatalities into life cycle assessment, so that we would have the work environment and natural environment impacts in life cycle assessment and look at them together. And then there was another student at the University of Montreal who was looking at occupational exposure to organic chemicals. And he published a couple of papers on that. And we have somebody from the University of Michigan, now it's Danish Technological University, looking at noise exposure. And so what has happened is there's a global consortium organized through the auspices of the UN, looking at, what's the word I'm looking for, consolidating a global life cycle assessment method. So all of the different frameworks that we use, what are best practices? And can we come to an agreement on what best practices are and work to adopt those globally? And they invited about 8 of us to also include methods for including occupational health and safety in LCA. So we're updating the methods that Kelly developed. We have a couple of papers forthcoming, and we'll be working to integrate those models into the global LCA process. Kishko is updating the one on organic chemicals. Noise exposure hopefully will be out soon. And then we also are working on one related to exposure to particulate matter. And then hopefully you'll see we're not covering all of the things that are on this list, but hopefully someday we will. Okay, third area is greenhouse gas accounting. One of my students just recently finished a study where he went through all of the CDP data for scope 3, I should say upstream scope 3 emissions, so supply chain emissions, and coded all of this data sources and methods that these companies said that they used. So he went through tens of thousands of rows of data and identified a handful of different methods that are used. So you can get your data directly from the supplier. You can get it from publicly available resources like CDP. You can get it from a growing number of disclosure systems. Publicly available resources like sustainability reports and things like that. Disclosure systems are systems like CDP. You can also get it from industry collaborations, which we're seeing a growing number of industry collaborations where industries will create centralized data systems and work with suppliers to capture information related to greenhouse gas emissions in a variety of forms to share that with the users of those products. Life cycle assessment right here, energy-based emission factors, activity-based emission factors, and spend-based method. A spend-based method is essentially where you look at how much you spend and you use that to estimate emissions based on industry averages. What I will say is all of this is based on LCA. Most of the emission factors are based on LCA. Probably some of the data that's coming out of suppliers is based on internal LCAs. So then what we did is we looked at, well, what are they actually using? And if you remember, I told you this orange, the red, this green are all based on LCA. So pretty much almost 80–90% of the methods that are being used to estimate greenhouse gas emissions are based on LCA. And so this is a study that'll come out soon. Why is this problematic? This is problematic because these LCA-based methods are all industry average methods, right? There's very little primary data from actual suppliers. And so they're using industry average emission factors and spend-based methods to estimate supply chain emissions. And now we're setting targets on data that's based on industry averages. So this is another big area of research is how do we get better data? I'll get to that as well. Okay, so now let's talk data. So there's 2 areas that are important areas that in terms of improving LCA. One is data harmonization. I talked about the global lifecycle assessment program. This is just another example that the tool that we're going to talk about today. So the defense input-output model, it's a spend-based method. Well, it's a hybrid method. It uses spend-based data and process-based LCA data but a lot of the data comes from existing sources that were created in the federal government. So from the US EPA's, their US Environmental Extended Input Output Model, the eGrid information about energy and emissions, and the GREET model, and many, many others. And so this is an example of how we use the best available data to create a tool specific for the organization that's using it. And so we'll talk a bit more about this tool later on today. And then increased data specificity. And so the Defense Input Output Model, in addition to using these available data sources that are based on what we see in the US economy, they're also developing process-based data specific to defense. And so we might have data related to energy that's on-site and purchase energy, military vehicles and weapon systems, transportation, and we can talk about what you'd like to see next. So this is taking industry average data, merging it with specific data for the user, in this case, the Department of Defense. And then there are a bunch of other initiatives underway that are really interesting in terms of getting better data, working more closely with suppliers, identifying ways to get to supplier data, creating disclosure systems, as I mentioned before, industry collaborations. And then there's blockchain and a lot of other IT methods. One of the projects that we have right now is that we used machine learning to try to estimate emissions for companies that don't report emissions. And I think we'll see a lot more of that in the future as well. So these are just some examples of the ways in which researchers are working to improve the extent to which LCA can actually inform decisions. Can I take questions now or?
Thanks, Shannon. Well, taking questions now, I think we can transition to the panel format. So if you'd like to come up, and Mr. Asiela and Mr. Simons as well, we've got these chairs set up, and I'd like to open it up to questions and answers and have a discussion format. And but before I do open it up for questions or answers, and I wanted to ask a question of the panel. I'm interested from your perspectives, if there was something new you learned from each other or questions that you had for each other to kick us off, and then we open it up for the audience. So I don't know if there's one of you that wants to kick it off with a topic.
I was saying, I really didn't know about some of those studies that you've been doing. I think that's fascinating. We have that information that I think we can share with each other. I know some are still work in progress, but as the feds go down this path, the more information the private sector and academia can provide us, helps everybody do our jobs, and helps her specifically, her leadership sectors think about what those targets might be. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe I learned how little progress we've had for 35 years, but I did a lot of SEMA Pro and LCA work in grad school, and at least we were using European averages sometimes. I feel like we've at least transitioned to American averages, but it's learning how much farther we still have to go. And to Dave's point, I think it's really interesting thinking about this from a federal government level. We need to calculate our own scope 3 emissions. We need our suppliers reporting data, but they don't want to report data until we know. And there's a huge interactivity and need to be collaborating together. And I know there's some international security issues and how we collaborate on data. And so just thinking about data flow, what can be flowed and what needs to be flowed for decision worthy calculations and reporting. So we don't need to measure everything. We need to measure the things that matter and matter for decision making to actually drive the action. Like, who cares what your scope 3 is? It's just a number. You want to know scale, magnitude, directionality, and that's the part. Is the I love your future focus.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point, especially about scope 3. I think that we've gotten really fixated on trying to get a complete estimate of scope 3 emissions at the, the unfortunate outcome is that we're not measuring anything accurately or completely. And so, and we're not engaging with those who can change those emissions. And so I think it's a really good point.
I think I see a question from
I really like the figure that you showed of the different categories of the scope 3 and bottom. But I wanted to touch on what you just said a little bit, full thread. I kind of work in Dave's office, and so part and with Betty and Mike me. So I'm definitely in with Katie on scope 3. So I'm seeing all of the pieces coming together. But I picked at the one point that you make, data, and the data is a little bit all over the place. So in trying to push forward and just getting data to begin with from some of the disclosure reports and getting companies to recognize they need to report, what activities are we doing or what processes are we thinking about in making consistency in reporting practices? I mean, are we are there standards? Are there frameworks? How are we building consistency in how companies and energy, or however we're looking, whatever type of data we're looking at, how are we making it consistent?
It's a question for me.
I mean, for anyone who's panel, it's a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's happening now that's pretty exciting is that, so we had this explosion of organizations that were collecting information and creating standards or guidelines or whatever you want to call it for how to collect data, how to report data. And so at this point, what's happening is these organizations are coming together because they know it's a problem and that we don't have consistent reporting. And then we also have statements that overestimate the extent to which we're reporting accurately. And that this is becoming a real problem. And so we're seeing a lot more collaboration just really in the last 1 to 2 years from those organizations to improve the situation, which I think is great. My big fear is that there's a lot of discussion around technology-based solutions for getting data. So for example, blockchain. And I fear that we're going to spend another 10 years investing in these initiatives and they're probably not going to be that effective because there's so many issues related to sharing proprietary data and things like that. And so I started this journey thinking that we really needed to work very hard to get very accurate information for everything. And I have changed drastically. And I think now what we need to do is maybe from an industry level, identify what is it that companies should quantify in their supply chain, what should be accurate. And I think we need to focus on, I don't know what industry, my industry is going to vary. Some industries are going to have very few suppliers that are 80-90% of their emissions. And those are the people you need to be working with. Someone's going to be, some of these more, some industries going to be, you're going to have 20, 30, 40, 50 suppliers that are 80%, and then you're going to have to make hard decisions about what's the most important. So my hope is that the conversation shifts in that direction. And I think we're hearing it start to. Sorry.
No, I want to call it, I love that answer because I think what it means is we're gonna have to start each of these independent processes at the beginning and defining our objectives up front, like what is good data and what defining. Now we're talking about a quality system and a quality process. And if you can look at each one of those industries differently and define what is good data out of that, you're exactly right. It cannot be perfect data, but it's just enough. This is what we can make a decision point on. And if you can find those go up front, I think that's what we can do.
I'm just going to add one thing. I think one of the top challenges that we have is that there are 2 reasons that we collect greenhouse gas data. One is to quantify risk, and that's mostly investors that are interested in this. And I think that the tools that we have that are basic industry average, it's good enough. We just want order of magnitude. What's our risk? But if our goal is actually to reduce emissions, we've got to change the way we're doing it.
Thank you.
Just to add to this, I think it's fascinating. And it's 2 things. One, in particular, like literacy. Like I think a lot, like even though some of the disclosures aren't perfect or great or decision worthy, that at least they show that as a partner, a supplier partner that you need to educate, they understand emissions, they're thinking about it and collaborate with them to drive and act where it's necessary. So I think part of it is even bringing everyone up to a level of who's understanding, really starting to calculate this stuff so that you can start there. And then the other point is on the parts that we don't really need accuracy for, we just need industry averages. To me, that's a really strong role for the federal government to help provide standardization of those data points. So in your work, you're thinking about where you wish there was an e-grid factor or emissions factor or a standard data point that you could then build off of to show yours is better than that industry average. I'm sort of starting to look at that. So as a person who just, can see places that there are no common data sets in the federal government.
So last, what I want to make along with this is, the data, first of all, the data acts, getting the data is critical. But then understanding what that data means and how we use that data is equally critical. And how does that then turn into, we in the federal government, the imposition of policy? So I don't know if we're there yet. I think there's gaps, there's inconsistencies. Once we get the data consistent, minimize the gaps, what are we doing with that? And how does that inform policy responsibility? So those, once we get to that point, then I think we're going to be going on that journey a lot more efficient.
I just wanted to add one thing to what Ms. Starnes was saying a minute ago about the federal government's role for increasing data and industry averages. We put a plug out for a project where Mr. Osceola and Dr. Bauer have increase the resolution of the defense input output model. So to the degree that there are data that you'd like to see, we'd like to hear that. So please share that afterwards.
So, is this on? So I come from the world of risk assessment, I'm an environmental toxicology person, and picked up on that in my first question. And so in that world, we use things like sensitivity analyses to help inform where we can prioritize our data collection efforts. So where do you get your most bang for the buck in driving it? So the question I have for you guys is, how is that playing in this process? And then the second component of that, of course, is there's always uncertainty. And how you mentioned, you don't want to just see one estimate, you want to see multiple estimates, and that sort of gets at that question of uncertainty. I'm just curious as to how do you accommodate uncertainty in these LCAs, and how do you, is sensitivity analysis being used to drive data collection efforts? Yes.
Yeah, so I think we've been doing a very good job. I think where we are is the LCAs that are focused on policy decisions and the LCAs that are focused on emerging technologies do a much better job. It's really interesting to me because there is just as much uncertainty as retrospective LCAs as products. But there's a sense that there isn't. But yeah, so I think that within the LCA, I think best practice really is best estimates and working best measurable outcomes. I don't think you can do anything better than that. And I do see studies where people are using Monte Carlo, and we really can't fit distributions to most of this data, and so the Monte Carlo is very helpful. So I think scenario analysis is really the way to go from a certain perspective. From a sensitivity analysis perspective, in terms of identifying where we need to get better data, I think one of the challenges is that many of the studies, when you do the sensitivity analysis, oftentimes you can't get better data. So you don't have the contact, you don't have that data. But I think that with some of the tools that are coming along in terms of estimating data from different locations. So for example, as mentioned before, a lot of the data that we use in LCA is SERDP data, it still is today, unfortunately. And so what we do, there's a growing number of tools that utilize different types of data to estimate what the environmental data is for products made in different parts of the world. And I think as we see more of that in LCA, that will help us in terms of seeing the uncertainty of data.
I think a lot about corporate level data, so it's like you characteristics of 1, 2, and 3 in that world. There's the SEC's version, which is about materiality. Legal terms, that was material to report for a company. And then in our proposed case for supplier work and procurement, that's about relevant data. So what is relevant to this company or to the sector or to this procurement? So I think at different levels of data reporting, different terms and different definitions and different needs of granularity and of the data, but that's all relates to sort of how granular and how verified and how substantive we need to be to make appropriate decisions and better functionality. So I'm glad it's being built into the LCA all the way up.
No.
We have another question.
I think you mentioned that LCA is done, let's say, in isolation of product development. And I do understand what comes if you ask companies on what are emissions and all those kind of things. But from the company point of view, if you develop some new product and you want to make a comparison what is good, then you need to have the access with it. The question is how to arrange that the company itself is making these comparisons. I'm lucky I have in our institute a department that does it, but I don't know if that's everyone the case. How do you see that? How to arrange it?
Can I ask the same question? How do you design something without using LCA?
Well, so I'm not really sure I'm following your questions. So are you asking if you don't have the LCA data, then you make a change? How do you use?
So is it more of it's a new product? Yeah, there's nothing to compare it to.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that's interesting. It's covered in some of those studies on LCA's emerging technologies. So what do you do when you have a new technology and there's a market?
Yeah.
What do you compare it to? And so this gets into this area. So most of LCA is what we call attributional. So you're sort of looking at what are the emissions associated with doing this thing? You know, what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with doing this thing? But consequential LCA is that what are the consequences of this change? And so if you were to introduce a completely new product into a market space that's completely new, how does that change the environmental impact and the global economy? And so this is a new area of research called consequential LCA. And in fact, it's actually quite important in scope 2 greenhouse gas emission reporting. Because right now we take an attributional approach for the most part. And so specifically with renewable energy certificates. So you use electricity from the grid, whatever that mix may be, most likely has some non-renewable energy from the US, right? And then you purchase these renewable energy certificates with the assumption that there are consequences associated with buying those renewable energy certificates, and somehow things change in the economy, and now you effectively are zero emissions. But it's actually taking an attributional approach and assuming that it's consequential, because it didn't actually look at the consequences. And so this is a really, it's an evolving area in LCA. We all know it's a very important potential application with new technologies. We're not there yet. We're trying to understand. So we're going to be working with econometric models and things like that to try to get at what happens to those new things under this market space.
I just wanted to add that our colleagues at the Advanced Manufacturing Office in the Department of Energy are doing some interesting research here from a consequential lens, looking at groundbreaking technologies and how do you assess that when there's no market for these technologies. So just kind of building off of what Dr. Lloyd is saying. So even apart from academia, there's some work in the government space here. I think we have time for one more question and then we're at the end of the panel. Is there one more question from the audience? Doctor?
Also, it's still on my desk. I do a lot of process meeting engineer for fuel facilities. So one of the things that comes to mind is that my hope is that this is a living process. What I see a lot of times in NAVFAC and military construction and maintaining buildings is nobody considers building maintenance for changing costs of building maintenance. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how do we do LCA midstream while we're using the product? We have to update that over and over because energy cost changes, their supplier changes, the dynamics of our local neighbors and what they give us changes too. So what are we doing to improve that? Because a lot of people think, okay, we have the price of a piece of drywall. That's very concrete and discrete. But there's all kinds of things that we have to consider. it's forever as well. And it's like, and I know you're talking about granularity, but those scope 3 costs, are really hard to convince people on when a piece of drywall has a price tag. And they think that's the price, you know. And if this one's cheaper than that one, we owe it to the taxpayer to buy the cheaper one, even though that probably has a lot of scope 3 issues. That they more expensive one anyway. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Like, how do we handle this midstream and capture LCA midstream?
Well, I mean, that's $1 million question, right? I mean, that is, I think that at least the Department of Defense, we've been trying to, with the life cycle costs, forever, in an integrated economic policies. The problem is, it's really hard to convince. We got a limited budget, where your command officer has X amount, we have full resources to do what they need to do. So are they going to go with life cycle costs or assessment of product, or are they going to go what will work for less cost, even though somebody's back. I think the sustainability analysis guy is just one tool that will help make some of those decisions. They'll inform some of those decisions. It's still up to them to make it. And, we're a zero-sum game organization, right? We get X amount of money, we don't turn it back, we don't spend more. And so that is one of the bigger challenges we have.
Yeah, I want us to can we fix our existing roofs instead of always looking at, well, there's the shiny building we're gonna build. Sorry.
I'm not actually considering, but we found there's some decisions that are being made now. So you make a decision on saying this is like a building. I've been told by my leadership, well, people spend more in the windows because especially so we don't spend more or at least less station. Because if you look at the big picture, overall, it's not even a life cycle cost, it's cheaper in the long run, right then and there. If you can demonstrate that, and that would not do it necessarily. But there's, I guess, organizations, international, that are doing these kinds of things, and make that assessment say, no, we're going to invest a lot more in this window. Because we invest nearly as much in nature.
Yeah, I think it gets to the point of price versus cost, and we know the price of that is drywall, but we don't know the full cost of it or of the alternatives to put it with, and then the operational costs. So I think it's a very, very live discussion. I would say there's a variety of other places where you're covering it like immediately, which is like the transition to zero emission vehicles, which have a higher upfront price tag, but as we know, a lower cost of ownership over the life of that vehicle. And those are two different budgets, managed completely differently in most agencies, and getting the ability to spend more on the upfront to then save the operational and all the ancillary knock-on impacts, both positive and negative in that process, is a good job for people like you to take on. So thank you. I mean, in buildings, we've got ESCOs, receiving contracts. There's a lot of different ways that we're making. We got updating our contracting, our budgeting processes to account for costs.
I think also another aspect that you're getting at is that there is a societal cost associated with not reducing energy consumption and therefore not reducing emissions and therefore having more impacts, right? And so one of the tools that we do have is to estimate the social costs associated with these externalities and include them in our analyses. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. But I work a lot with private sector companies, and that's a really hard story to tell. But within the federal government, it's already done. And there are regulatory impact analyses that are done by regulators to look at look at the direct costs associated with these regulations on the government and to citizens, but you also look on the societal costs or benefits associated with passing the regulation. And those are looked at to determine whether or not this regulation makes sense, right? And as a federal agency, it seems to me that this would be an area where potentially we could make inroads in terms of including that social cost. So I showed you the 4 areas that we look at: environmental quality, human health. We could, it is controversial, we can't put a dollar figure to the social costs associated with those, and then look at that as well. So that might be one way to start thinking about that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
It's the controversy.
not easy, is it?
You got a spine, you say it, and it still gets rejected. That's fine.
Yeah.
One last question.
Hi, I'm Vinay Gadkari. I worked at the hotel. And 24 years ago, I joined the hotel in the life cycle management and sustainability group. Then 9/11 happened, and then all the funding from DOD in that area kind of went away. So of course, I still continue to work in DOD and work a lot with different DOD agencies. And what I've always said is that I incorporate life cycle thinking and principles of sustainability in process optimization, resource optimization. I've done a lot of transformation and process improvement projects at various depots. But if we lead with this sustainability thing, nobody wants to buy it. There is no funding attached to it. So we have always focused on, at least I have focused on KPIs at the Directorate of Aircraft Maintenance, right? What is my mission, my combat readiness, my mission readiness, and that has paid for some of those programs. So then my question now is to John. Now we have to have a sustainability analysis statement of need for this certain projects. How are we going to address that cost aspect? Because as long as there is this, low cost or lowest price technically acceptable thing going on in DMV, it's really difficult to get through it. So is there any thought on how this requirement to incorporate sustainability analysis in every statement of need for certain how that would be evaluated and how it works? So, but the panel would also address the question.
Good job on the slide. So, yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a culture change working and going in this direction. And all right, so when we talk about sustainability, we're not talking about necessarily we talk about resilience. We're talking about making sure that we are resilient enough to do the job we need to do as a defense department. And I'm not a Department of War or Department of Defense. We have an issue with that. Our people, our country, and those resources that are provided. Mr. Kidd likes to talk about. We have three trusts. There are three trusts. We're entrusted management, the sons and daughters of our people who are in uniform. That's one trust. We're entrusted with, he says, a boatload of money, right? They gave us a ton of money. Other agencies, I'm sorry, we do that a lot of money. And we're entrusted with our resources, the land, the air, the water, the energy. So we have those three trusts. And if we don't respect that, we don't understand that, then we're not doing our jobs. I think part of the sustainability analysis is getting to those trusts, protect the people, protect the equipment where all that money is being spent, and protect the resources. So I think that's why sustainability analysis is key.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess to add to that is we need to, first off, there's often a number of environmental regulations or key regulations associated with causing a driver for change. And those are going to help in a lot of aspects. They'll kind of force the hand of change. If you're talking about something that is, there's maybe no environmental regulations, but it's environmentally preferred versus the current technology, I think this is really where sustainability analysis can be extremely useful to kind of paint the business case to the DoD or to a company, an OEM, of why they should potentially consider the change, rather than it just being a technological benefit, which is often the way I have historically tended to look at things in my technical world. But we need to look at it from a business perspective. There's a cost associated with it, and it's very easy to buy the cheap drywall. But what we've seen time and again, Robert Herron spoke about this yesterday, that the costs usually are far more than we predict that they are. We need to do a better job of figuring that out. And that sustainability analysis will help paint that picture and say, those tail costs that we normally ignore are going to be much worse if we're using the incumbent product versus the alternative. And
yeah, it's not necessarily the easiest to exactly quantify that, but and that is a real challenge. How do you quantify that? And it's, I come from the chemical engineering world. I can draw boxes around things. Sometimes we draw the box too big, sometimes we draw it too small. We got to figure out the right box to draw it around and figure out the inputs and outputs on just that box to make it as simple as possible. And I'm hoping that's something that some people I know over there can help with. But yeah, not a simple thing, but I do think we need to show that picture. It doesn't need to be perfect, but if you give it no thought, then the viewpoint is, oh, great, it's bio-based and it's more expensive. Or it's economically, it's environmentally friendly, a lot more expensive. That's the immediate other thing. Or there's a negative associated with the performance that I can't withstand. So you got to paint that picture of, it's actually going to be an ROI of 5 years. It's not bad. Maybe 5 years, give or take 5 years. No.
Just to add to what Dr. Lascaux was saying, so in addition to the sustainability analysis guide, which is a department-wide resource available for use, SERDP ESTCP is beginning to develop a toolkit for SERDP ESTCP researchers with respect to how to develop this kind of analysis for emerging technologies, recognizing that there are specific challenges in this space. And with that, we are over time. So I think we're going to end the panel and take a 10-minute break where we're going to recommence the session with Dr. Boma. But if we could be back by 3:12, we'll continue then.
All I can hear sounds like.
You find it fascinating. You're pro. Yeah, but like there's so many steps to it that you have to do it in a certain order too. And it looks like you're fumbling around.
Do you have, I don't have Dr. Boma's bio with me. Is that on Sense? And I didn't earlier.
It's on the website. Yeah, it's on the symposium website that has everybody's bio. Just send it. You look great, bio. Send it to Michael. Yeah. Thanks. I don't know. It's on it. It is or isn't? There's so many names. But it's been this mic on right next to you. Is yours black? Wow.
Right now, we're working with a multi-university group focuses on service engineering, manufacturing, very broad. But so we're just a lot of different things. They're most grateful the training for some specific
There's a cooler right outside the yeah. Hopefully it's not. This other one is right. Do you want to be
I think
stick to I don't know. Some people have a preference. All right, this makes sense. Yes. Yeah.
Do we have Dr. Rose? That's okay. Well, hello. We're now at 3:13, and so we're going to kick off the second half of the short course. We are running a little bit behind, so we'll try to be a little more efficient in the second half of the short course. We're going to start with Dr. Richard Boma, and who is here in the room. We also have Dr. Tom Leichhardt, who is his collaborator, and Dr. Richard Boma. We're excited for him to talk about his life cycle assessment of NC-based signal pyrotechnics. Dr. Boma is a sort of ESTCP funded PI, and so what we were excited for him to talk about an active project and how he's implementing life cycle assessment as part of his project. So thank you so much, Dr. Boma.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I prepared this together with Tom Leichhardt because I'm in the energetic materials department, and so developing this pyrotechnics. And my colleague Tom Leichhardt is from a department where they do sustainability analysis, life cycle analysis, emission calculations, those kind of things. So we combined the expertise in our expertise in this project. First, to show you let's say the aim of the project was to make something which is environmentally more benign, and at the same time, a signal flare to produce a color, but it's with a selectable wavelength. So we had ourselves 3 tasks, and basically you can see that in the green blocks. That is on the system level. That is how to produce a signal that you can choose the color. In blue, that's more on the composition level. That's also experimental. That is changing the composition. We had a baseline composition, a nitrocellulose-based composition developed for the fireworks company. And we could start from that composition and to bring that, let's say, more to in line with the performance of the current military compositions. And they have these drawbacks that they are not nice to the environment. In parallel, and that's the red block, we have done the sustainability analysis. And if you go from top to bottom, that is actually, you see the 3 years of the project. And what we do is the sustainability analysis to guide the experimental work. And in the experimental work, we're also going to change the compositions and the products, and both work together. And also the complexity of the sustainability analysis will increase with the years. So in the first year, on the left-hand side, I will not go into detail on the experimental side that has been presented here in the conference on a poster, but only on the sustainability analysis part of the project. In the first year, we will do a qualitative impact assessment. The second year, we go to a, let's say, quick scan life cycle analysis, and we're currently in the final year, and we're also doing a full life cycle assessment. I'll get more into the details, and for you to follow in the block in the right upper corner, you see where we are in the phase of the project. So in this slide, we're doing in the first year a qualitative impact assessment. This one is a rather simple method. Chemicals have hazard statements, risk statements, and you can assign a certain value to it. And these risk statements, hazard statements, they have to do something with the hazards to the physical hazards, for an explosion, fire, can also be human health hazards, and can be ecosystem hazards. There is this method developed originally by the German company BASF to attribute these hazard statements, you have to divide those, and what you have to do is score each hazard statement. And what you then do is say, I have a composition, and just in the bottom I have an example, and the ingredients are not of importance, but here you have the percentages of the ingredients, and for each ingredient you say, you rank the number, the total of your hazard score, and it's divided over physical, human health, and ecosystem hazards. So if I have nitrocellulose and it takes up 81.5% of the composition, and the hazard of nitrocellulose will be 10,000, and I come here to just over 8,000. This is how it works. It's just based on the hazard statement. Now, we've done that for the military reference as well, because we want to compare. We've done that also for the baseline composition we started with, the nitrocellulose-based composition. And we made variations in this first year. So we thought about some compositions to make it more military-like composition. So the 5 columns on the left are the red colors. We're producing a red color. And then when we fire this projectile into the air, these are the green colors, and green is not the environmental green, but the green color which you can see. Just to make sure for this talk. And this is white, but it's we've done it in the first year, but it's not necessary for the development of this concept. But if you see here for the red color, for example, this bar has a certain value, so almost a value of 3,000. It says something, and our reference was much lower, so below 1,000. We knew that already, we anticipated that. We've made variations to it, so the score of the hazard statements is less than 1/3 of the military reference, so we were happy with that. The same you can do for the green composition, and so actually you can also compare the red and the green, because you have a mechanism to compare. So this confirmed that we were on the right way to start with these nitrocellulose-based compositions. Another thing we did in the first year, and it's another method to quantify is to use the cumulative energy demand. So, and it's just to say you have a certain composition. I know the amount of the composition, the ingredients, and for each ingredient, I know how much energy it will cost to make it. So you weigh in the composition and you get a value, and you can express the energy needed, and that's here in 10 per 10 gram of composition. So you, so based on the composition, you can just say, I need so much energy. And it's a kind of predictor of how good it is for your purposes. So for because if you use energy to make it, that will have an impact on the environment as well. So this is one type of predictor for the sustainability analysis. Now again, we can here to the now it's to the left, the 5 columns. They are the green colors, and here is again the military reference comes up here. And this was our baseline nitrocellulose-based composition, and we made modifications, but overall we were better off also for our new compositions. This is the red military reference, and our baseline composition was way down here, but we made modifications here. But whatever we changed, we were well below the energy demand of the reference, the military reference. So this was done in the first year. We were happy with that. At the same time, we had to improve luminosity, the color perception, the stability of the materials, because this is a nitrocellulose. For those that don't know it, but it's a normal component in a gun propellant, but you have to stabilize it. Here we had Originally, we used metal carbonates to do that. They were not always that good, so we introduced another known stabilizer. So, and that was a reason to change the composition. So we take also that into account. In the next slide, so now we're going to the second year. We're going to quantify in a quick scan life cycle analysis, and we are going to use environmental prices to quantify the effect. There are different approaches, and the one we've chosen is to use damage costs, and I will go through that. It's just one way. You can also say, I want to quantify the abatement cost. So if I have something polluted, how much does it cost to restore? But we do a different method. Also, different levels of prices, but we used midpoint levels, and they are used to quantify the effects of certain impact categories. And that was in also in the presentations before the break. It's not only CO2, there is volatile organic compounds, and you can have different impact categories, and they are listed here. Particulate matter, global warming, water use, you can specify those. You can also say, what is the damage pathway? And in the end, you can say, is it damage to the human health, to the ecosystem, or to resource availability? So this is the classification of the impact categories. Then comes the next step. We have here a little bit different order, but the same impact categories. And then you have to, if you want to quantify, to say, I need to express in a certain unit. So for example, for climate change, I express in kilogram CO2 equivalent. You've ozone depletion, so you've here CFCs, human toxicity, there's benzene equivalents. Now, you have all kinds of equivalents. So whatever you're producing, you have to make the transfer into this unit, and then you need to quantify the damage cost. And in Europe, we have it's quite recent book on the environmental prices. So actually the background is quite a report you can easily find on the internet, and it tells how these prices were, what is the background to it. It's an average of also different locations, etc. So there is more detail to it, but we use the average prices for example, 1 kilogram CO2 equivalent. So this is all defined, so that is standard now within our project. Then comes the next question, okay, if we have a military signal flare, or we have a nitrocellulose-based signal flare, what does it produce? And also in production, how much energy is needed, etc. So we look to the same impact categories. We have this unit here, and this is this composition. So per kilogram, I have a certain damage cost. So it's not a real damage. It's not the cost of producing the unit. It's the quantification of damage per impact category. So in the next slide, now first of all, what we in this quick scan life cycle analysis did was to look to the transport of the raw materials, because it needs to come to your production side. We look to the composition, of course. The military references are made using a solvent. The new compositions we can make just by a water pressing process. We got details from the company. We have Namo Perry is from Florida, is involved in this project, so they could advise us we use this equipment and this much of energy is needed for it. We also have to dry the ethanol and the butter out, and then we have a product. So we look to that, and we look to the different life cycle phases. So you have the constituents production, you have the production of the flare product itself, and you have the use of the flare. So here you will see the cost price. So in this case, it's euros. Okay, say €1 for euro is $1 more or less. Then you have an idea what the damage costs are per kilogram of flare composition. So you can really quantify that. Again, here you have three. That's the red color, and here you have the green color. And again, the large bar is the military reference. So also in this approach, the quantification showed that the new compositions were still better than the military reference. But we can also see, because the damage costs are split over the various impact categories. So even if it's all euros or dollars, you can just identify where the costs are, the damage costs. So we can see, for example, that the for the red colors, the damage costs are predominantly in constituents production, so not in the production of the flare. That is not really an issue. And for the green, it's basically, it comes into the use of the product. We can directly see that from this. Just recently, we did a calculation in more detail, and that's also why we should work together, the LCA people and the people developing a new product. Because, for example, in this case, we look to the products as being formed, because it's not only making your product, but it's a military product. So we want to produce the signal, and the signal, the reaction products can cause the damage as well. So that is part of this picture. So initially, in the picture on the left, it was like everything is burned, and then we look to the reaction product. So it's a stoichiometric burn. But in my group, where we do pyrotechnics, we have also chemical codes to predict how good does a composition burn or detonate or whatever. Using that into account, then for the use phase, so if you really fire a signal flare, then there is more particulate matter formed, just based on the composition. So that's accounted for here on the right. This is only valid for the emission phase. For the use phase, because of the particulate matter, that's the orange that really comes out. So therefore, the damage costs are high. It doesn't apply to all flares, because not all flares are being used by the military by functioning, and that brings to the full life cycle analysis. We are now in the process to do that, and we had a lot of help with Nobody's to discuss the method, but also to get contact with the user community. So they got us in contact with the right people within the US DoD to discuss with us what is the life cycle. And for a normal signal flare, if you just fire it in the air, those products, you have an initial stockpile. So that is, you buy a lot of this material and it goes into storage. And from storage, you perform trading. So a certain amount of flares is being used. That's the intentional use. Apart from training, it's not consumed, you inspect, it goes back into storage. In the end, you have a certain percentage which is being fired normally. It can happen. Figures there are more difficult, but they are used actually to be used in a mission when it's there. So in a mission, you take a certain amount of flares with you, and a certain percentage will be used. There's also a number of flares that will not be used and will be discarded in a manner. And we consider that to be open burn. Whereas the main part of the products are in storage and at end of life, and actually that's the main part of your material and your products will be just destroyed, and we assume in a furnace with proper burning. So therefore the open burn in a mission area, we consider that different, and that's the picture from the previous slide, as the burning in an open furnace. So therefore you have to split your product over a realistic scenario. So this is what we have gone through with the DoD user community, how much is being used and how much is destroyed end of life. There is another thing what we have to do, because we make a product which with the idea to have a selectable wavelength, or let's say a selectable color. Just to have the concept, or one of the concepts is given here, and it is you have a pyrotechnic composition that produces a green color, you have one that produces a red color, and on demand you fire a green or a red one, or you fire both at the same time. And for a distant observer, that's not the one, this is looking into the flame in the lab. This picture from our partner, South Dakota School of Mines. So they made this picture, this project. You see the green, you see the red, but if you're in the distance, you will see orange. So actually, by having two compositions, we can produce 3 colors. This is not a product that's out at this moment for the military. So we have to make our own version, our own scenario to as a basic reference to do the full life cycle analysis for the new product. We also had some thoughts from the military from that, but we don't have the actual numbers, but that's the discussion you need to have and to do. In the end, we will have this picture with real numbers. We will have a similar picture, but then that applies to this situation with assumed numbers. And we can just apply the data which I've shown in the previous figure to have a full life cycle analysis. So that's where we are. So from the initial start of the project, we confirmed what we thought that the human health and ecosystem hazards were below the military reference, so that was good. And then later on, we went to the damage costs, and it's still better in the simplified life cycle compared to military reference. And yeah, in particular, toxicity and particular matter is reduced a lot for all compositions, but especially for the red color. And this approach was successful. We were changed both the composition, so experimentally, and we made a new product in the phase of doing that, even if it's a very low TRL level. And we did that also on the sustainability analysis to have that going at the same time. I did not go into detail about the composition changes we've made, but for example, our own developed nitrocellulose composition, the fireworks composition, had Dechlorane Plus in it as a chlorine donor, just the same ingredient, which is in the military reference. And that's not a nice one for the environment. So in the second year, we changed that to the polyphenylidene dichloride, and that's a polymer, and which is environmentally benign compared to Dechlorane Plus. So we did that experimentally and in the sustainability analysis. But we did also other changes, like having more luminosity by putting in RDX or just metals like aluminium burning or titanium burning. But overall, the approach worked together, and you have to do it together, as you said. Yeah. So if there are questions, then I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
So I'm guessing, since you used standard LCA method, it was primarily focused on human health related to environmental releases, not occupational. And the reason I asked is because the majority of your impacts were from particulates and from human toxicity. So I'm wondering if you were to include occupational health and safety, if the difference was getting bigger.
If looking at, we have both human and ecotoxicity incorporated.
Okay, but the human health, I'm guessing, I don't know the methods that the midpoint methods that you use.
Yes.
I've heard of them, that's it.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how they work.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing what they're looking at is human health impacts from releases to the environment. So you get things in the environment, they move around, and people are ultimately exposed,
Yes.
but they don't actually include occupational usually. And so if I were you, I think that's what I would look at, because it's particulates and human toxicity, I'd be worried about the people that are manufacturing the product. And I think your delta would get bigger between those alternatives if you added, don't you think?
Possibly, it's something we can talk about more.
Yes, it's more detailed, but I don't really get the point. But it's the particulate matter is in the use phase, so normally that should be in the open.
Okay, so that'd be
But knowing from other projects, also for training at firing ranges, there is also concern of the plume of just gun propellant, just from what comes from the barrel. People are exposed to that. So it's not about the actual exposure. So we just say particulates are being formed. So we try to quantify that. And then a damage cost is just associated with particulate formation. So it's not like to what extent is a person exposed to it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's good to this report, which was made by an institute in Delft for the European Union, to have these damage costs, because they have all the reference on how they come to these costs.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
study.
Yeah.
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 Just to look to see if they actually got that.
Yes. Yeah. I think that is. Yeah.
So you did this study after all the performance characterization was done on all of your player models?
Yeah. The performance. Yeah. So it's not in here, but we look to burn rates, to the colors itself, to measure if they have the right color. Actually, they were developed for fireworks. So, and then color is very important. So it's of lesser importance. So actually, we had very good colors, but you have to match the burn rate and the luminosity. That is a very important parameter for the military, because you fire a signal in the air, and it has to be seen from the distance. So, and that is important. So therefore, and for a certain duration. So the output in duration and luminosity, that is of importance. And we had to improve that. And we had, with night cellars quite high burn rate, so we had to lower that.
Right. So I know RDX and some of those tend to be challenging to make. Regarding ventilation and stuff, green smoke has been used in training on the ground with warfighters, and so particular exposures in that scenario may be a bigger issue. I don't know if I don't think red flares are, because green smoke is the product that's typically used. Whether they were using red flares
instead of smoke, I'm sure, but there's probably some lending of some data there on the
Yeah.
side versus the red
Yeah.
side.
We also quantified the smoke production itself of these flares, which is much less. So the military reference just from we had for the signal, it's yeah, I think something like 75% less of the order on a weight basis. So that is just that's a measure of particle formation and attraction of water from the environment on it, because that is what you see as what is screening. Yeah? So there's anyhow, the smoke production is much less than for an intended screening smoke. They also have toxicity issues, and colleagues have been working on that also in the SERDP project to address that. But that is really a different composition.
Well, thank you, Dr. Boma. We're at time. I just wanted to make a comment. It's not really a question. One thing that I appreciated about this project when we chatted earlier, Mr. Alciello mentioned the valley of death associated with emerging technologies, and this is something that we've talked a lot about with Dr. Oscala, and something that it's important for the research, development, and test evaluation community is not to conduct this research in isolation, but really to be engaged with the user community. So I think an early success anyway with this project has been the project team's engagement with the end user community across the Defense Department and maybe even the Ministry of Defense in Netherlands. And one way or another, I'm looking forward to the results, but I think that input is really valuable for validity of this study.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So now we're at the point of the short course where we're going to begin with a little bit of a presentation, but then actually have a few interactive exercises. So Lucas is passing out, and Nick to the audience a few sheets for interactive exercise so you can visualize what we're talking about with life cycle assessment. And I'll try to be brief since we are over time with some of the presentation materials, but Dr. Shannon Lloyd and myself will walk us through this interactive short course. So we're going to start with the sustainability analysis framework. And
we can be over here. We can be a duo. Okay, so we've sort of been in here already. So this is the sustainability analysis guidance that keeps coming up. Michael and I have both been involved with developing this over the past 10 or so years. But really it has two parts: the life cycle cost analysis, which we all know very well, and the environmental life cycle assessment, which we'll be talking about today. And the guide really doesn't provide new instructions on how to do cost analysis. What it does is it provides guidance on how to put them together to do a sustainability analysis. And so, of course, focusing on the internal costs here, and as we mentioned before, environmental impacts, looking for specifically at resource availability, climate change, human health, and ecosystem quality. And one thing that that we've done in this tool is to also go to external costs. Similar to the midpoints that were just shown, looking at how do we translate this into social costs. So we can look at both direct internal costs and then the external costs.
right, I'm going to talk a bit about the drivers. Ms. Crevens talked a good deal about the executive orders, but there have been a flurry of executive orders in the last 2 years related to sustainability. And I won't go through all of them, but and you can take a look at this after the presentation. But there are a couple of executive orders that are important for this process fairly directly. First one being Executive Order 13990, which directs the federal government to incorporate the social costs of greenhouse gases into decision-making. There's also Executive Order 1430, which Ms. Cremens talked about, again, directing agencies to consider social costs, greenhouse gases in procurement decisions and other decisions. There's Executive Order 1457, also known as the Federal Sustainability Executive Order. There is a lot here, including direction to achieve net zero, but also instructions for decreasing preference of PFAS in products. So there is a lot in that executive order. And then lastly, and importantly to this is Executive Order 1481, also known as the Bioeconomy Executive Order, which directs the federal government to sustainably increase the usage of biotechnology manufacturing, et cetera. Mr. Alciello talked about this earlier, so I won't say too much other than the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, which is the body of policy within the Defense Department that guides the acquisition process, includes language to direct users to consider environment, safety, and occupational health as part of the acquisition process. And the Sustainability Analysis Guide has a description of how to incorporate sustainability considerations within this policy framework. And it does include, as Shannon was saying, the internal costs and the external costs like social costs of greenhouse gases. This slide was also gone through earlier. It's now a requirement on many projects. So I assume that's why some of you are here today. I wanted to talk about what a requirement looks like for those of you who are funded PIs and are wondering, do I have to do this? So we have an example requirement here for development of an advanced coding system. The requirement begins with new innovative advanced protective coding and systems. And so this is getting at, you need increased performance for protective properties, or it needs to be easier to use, things like that. Then the requirement continues, the new system must be able to meet performance requirements. Again, the operational protective properties, the less complex application techniques. This is what you need to eventually transition across the department. And then there's language, it must be more sustainable. What does that mean? According to department guidance, this means reduced life cycle costs and impacts, and those impacts are associated with human health and the environment. So what we were talking about earlier. And then other important characteristics are energy efficiency, improved chemistry. And then lastly, when compared with current and legacy systems. So Dr. Lloyd was talking about this doesn't happen in isolation. It's when we're comparing it to the legacy or what's currently available and what our future state is. So this is a comparative assessment. We have an example statement of need here as well, where life cycle assessment can be applicable. There's a hydrofluorocarbon statement of need, HFCs. Background on this one, HFCs have a really high global warming potential. The AIM Act is directing the United States to phase down usage based on global warming potential. And these are a really important subset of chemicals that the United States needs to meet its Paris Agreement nationally determined contributions for greenhouse gases. The problem is these HFCs are integrated into weapon system subsystems. And so therefore SERDP and ESTCP have released a statement of need to try to address this. And the sustainability analysis, for example, could be used here, quantify life cycle greenhouse gas emissions reductions and associated costs in accordance with the guidance we were just talking about. All right, now we're going to get into the framework.
All right, so we give you a crash course in earlier presentations, so now we'll just go a little bit deeper to explain what LCA is a little bit more broadly. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so you've seen this, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so these are the steps of conducting a sustainability analysis. So this is the most important step. Everybody forgets that this is the most important step, defining the scope. Because we routinely just decide, oh, we're going to just compare this to this. What does that mean? We need to know exactly what questions do we want to answer. So if the questions that you want to answer is what can I do to improve the environment, to reduce the environmental impact of this product, you do a different analysis than if you want to compare two things that exist today, something that you're planning on just dropping in as a substitute for something that exists today versus something that you're planning to develop that might be used in a unique application or a different application. So you have to get the scope right. And the only way to get the scope right is if you sit down with all the stakeholders involved and the practitioners who are going to be working on the project to understand what questions you want to answer. Okay, so that's step one. Then step two is we develop the life cycle inventory. This is all of the flows, inputs and outputs associated with usually the systems, usually it's more than one system that you're looking at. So usually the systems that you're comparing. And then we have step three, which is the life cycle cost analysis. Step four, which is estimating the life cycle impacts. We'll get into that in a second. And then synthesizing the results. And I wanted to point something out. In the previous slide, if you look back in past short courses, these two are flipped. I flipped them. Because when you do a life cycle cost analysis, if you do it correctly, you have about 80% of the data you need to do a screening life cycle assessment. So the quality of the life cycle assessment depends on what data you have here. So if you want a really detailed one, you have to go to your suppliers and get specific data from them. Then you go to their suppliers and get data from them. But we have enough data to do the screening analysis using the industry average characterization factors is what we call them, that we have. And you can do that usually with life cycle cost analysis. And so that's one thing I want to point out is if you're doing life cycle cost analysis, you probably have about 80% of the data that you need with the tools that we have to do a decent screening level LCA. Next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this. This is basically the same thing in a little bit more detail, but in the interest of time, I think we should move on. Again, these are the inputs and outputs. It's really much longer than this. We're getting to the point where we're adding things related to occupational health and safety and other aspects into the inputs as well. But the things we talked about before, all the materials and energy and natural resources that are being used, and all of the outputs associated with the processes to manufacture and use and sustain the system. Again, so here we are, we're estimating costs and we're looking at the direct, indirect, and contingent internal costs on the life cycle costing side. And again, on the LCA side, we're looking at human health, ecosystem quality, climate change. We forgot the resources one here. And then we also will look at external costs. And one thing I really want to emphasize is do not put together the external and the internal costs. That is really bad practice. They are not the same thing. So what we see all the time is in studies where we monetize the external costs and we have a stacked column that has internal costs and then external costs stacked on it. I really advise against these are two different things. Okay. All right, so again, now we're going to get into just focusing on the LCA part of it. And you heard this term midpoint a second ago. And good portion of talking about midpoint. So we're going to try to explain midpoint. So we have the process, when we collect the lifecycle inventory data, we're looking at the process, we're understanding all of the steps associated with all of the processes in the system that we're looking at, quantifying all of those inputs and outputs, and creating an inventory. Just basically an accounting process. We're just accounting for all of the flows associated with these processes. So now we have an inventory of the material, energy, and everything else, all the other flows associated with that process. Well, then what we want to do, and this is the work that you do, okay? You don't do this work. There are tools to do this work. All of these are based on models that have been developed to translate these flows into estimates of potential environmental impacts. So this is the hard part. But what you do have to do is decide what tools will you use, because there are right now many tools out there. And as I mentioned, there is an effort to create a globalized, harmonized tool for doing this. But right now, there's a bunch of different tools out there. DIO, which we're going to talk about, the Defense Input Output Model. We've selected what we think should be the tool that we should use in the US. But midpoint basically is it's an indicator of impact. So what it's doing is it's taking all of the things that contribute to each one of those impact categories that we talked about. So everything that contributes to climate change. So all of the greenhouse gases, everything that contributes to human toxicity, everything that contributes to ozone depletion. And you put them into those boxes and say, well, how much do they contribute to those things? And those are midpoints. So you could have up to 14, 15, 20 different midpoints, depending on the number of environmental categories that you're looking at. Then we have the areas of concern, the things that are impacted. So human health, the environment, availability of resources, the climate. So really, we generally look at those four. So we take all of those different impact categories, and then we say, well, how much did that contribute to damage to these endpoints? And so now we go from maybe 15 or 20 categories to usually 3 or 4. And then there's the weighting. And that's really what monetization is. It's weighting. Say, well, how important do we think each of these things are? What's the cost associated with the damage to these things and putting them in one unit? There's many ways to weight. The way that we're doing it is monetization. All right, so this is the tool we've been talking about. Some of the times,
Can I ask a question on the 30?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's really important to reiterate that if I have this right. You're saying for the technical people that are doing this is or technical people working on an alternative is they should focus on the process and inventory.
Yep.
And there are tools to do the other things.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
I think it's important to understand what those tools are doing, but we have tools, and don't create your own, because if you create your own, these tools have been reviewed by many, they're robust. We go out creating our own, we create problems at this point. Use these tools. You stop here, and like I said, when you do a life cycle cost analysis, you've got 80% of this. You just need to get a little bit more information. Mostly it's about the specific energy that's being consumed, the air emissions that's on site, things like that. Absolutely.
And that's the toolkit that we'll be working on this year will have further description of how to do just that.
All right, so then, as I mentioned, one of the main tools is the Defense Input Output Model. And what this model does is it combines a variety of data sources to allow users or LCA practitioners, I guess, to use this tool to convert everything into those impacts that we've talked about. And so you can do that based on industry sector. So if you're purchasing materials from an industry sector, you can estimate the amount of dollar value that you purchase from that sector to estimate the environmental impact. If you are releasing emissions on site, you can enter those physical releases into the tool to give the estimate of damage. We'll go through an example. Here is the website where it is available.
And we are updating the DIO, so this year there will be an update posted.
All right, and so then the final step is synthesizing the results. And this is, you saw results in the previous presentation, comparing different alternatives side by side. It's basically what we do. The goals here are to compare alternatives, but also to identify areas for improvement. So what are the processes, products, materials, what things in that life cycle are driving impact? And quite frankly, the best use of an LCA in your, in an R&D process is to do an LCA of the current, alternative, the current baseline, to figure out where should I invest my time to reduce impact? Where are the opportunities to reduce impact? And then start that process.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about examples that we've done over the past few years, and then we'll get into a specific example. But some applications have included chrome plating alternatives for weapon systems sustainment in the Navy. Also, various LED lighting designs on a littoral combat ship. We also worked on additive versus traditional manufacturing for aviation fuel nozzles. Additive manufacturing is a very interesting use case because we're talking about fundamentally changing manufacturing processes. Also, backup
and renewable power scenarios at specific installations, engine designs for ships. You're about to see the Tagnite depot configuration, explosives manufacture, PFAS-free alternatives to firefighting foam, which really deserves its own discussion. So now we'll walk into the Tagnite regional depot configuration. So once again, the sustainability analysis process consists of a 5-step iterative process. We began with the goal and scope, and so here on the left, what you can see is where we began to scope and build that the process. Oh my goodness, the map of processes. And so this example is of a Tagnite regional depot configuration. And just a little background here, magnesium components are critical in many aircraft systems, especially rotary wing systems, as magnesium provides low weight strength. The current industry practice is to coat magnesium parts using conversion coatings, which contain hexavalent chromium. So in this example, SERDP and ESTCP partnered with the Army and industry to evaluate Tagnite, a chrome-free conversion coating for magnesium that provide additional corrosion protection. As part of this, though, we need to change the existing depots. So there's some major changes to support infrastructure for these sustainment operations. So what we did was we assessed multiple operations configurations and included the baseline process at all depots and looked at different operation scenarios, which included consolidation of operations at fewer depots. But we started by defining the activities that are within and outside the scope. So that's on the left. And after we defined the system boundaries, we further developed the process flow diagram on the right, which is closer to what we modeled. And so on the right, you can see the process line, the heat that to the process line, the water production, also the wastewater treatment, and then the inputs and outputs that system. We have the DIO on the left, which is a representation then of the supply chain emissions associated with this depot process. So the process flow diagram on the right is a simplified version that we use for modeling. And then what we did was we did multiple scenarios. So you can see on the left, we had this similar process flow diagrams, but one had one version of how this process would be implemented, the other had a different version. And so we had several scenarios. We had at least 3. I don't recall how many there were at this moment. But then on the right, we estimated the life cycle costs and conducted impact assessment to estimate the external costs or environmental impacts. And so here we have the values on the right are in carbon dioxide equivalents. It's that climate change category. And so you can see that for this analysis, that the alternatives, depending on the configuration, had a lower or higher global warming potential or carbon dioxide equivalents. And then there you can also see the cost implications with the different scenarios. So now we'd like to walk in a hands-on exercise so we can imagine actually doing one of these analyses. I think we've passed out the sheets, but I don't know, Shannon, do you? Okay, so this is the life cycle inventory, what we've been talking about. This is what you as PIs will do. You will define the scope of your analysis, whether in this case, I think we have coatings removal process here. And then upstream from that, there's procurement and manufacturing of the materials that are used in coatings removal. There's an end of life. But now what you need to do as part of this, after you've defined this goal and scope, is think about what are some of the inputs and outputs for this process. So like to ask some of you, what are some inputs that you could imagine for coatings removal process? I don't know, we'll open it up.
Question first. So are you saying that what we're already seeing on the paper and on the screen is steps 1 and 2 completed?
It's step 1 completed, and now we're going to do step 2, the inventory. So the inputs and outputs. Thank you for the question. Yeah. So do we have any guesses or what some inputs to the system might be? So there's definitely energy. That's an input here. Labor is also for sure an input. Chemicals are most definitely an input. Water as well, great. How about some outputs? Air emissions, yeah, for sure. Wastewater as well. In this case, you might, in LCA, we would call that the product. And so that would be associated with the product as well, yeah. I think that's pretty good. So here, did your example look like this? Here are just some generic inputs and outputs that we had defined. We had energy, materials, chemicals, water. I think y'all hit every one of them. And then the outputs, we had products and co-products. I heard even byproducts, air emissions, water effluents, worker exposure, waste, etc. So I think everyone was kind of was tracking here with what some of the inputs need to be for the life cycle inventory. And this is what you as PIs need to collect as part of your project. Okay, now we'll jump into the exercise about how to estimate costs. Give you a second to think about this, but what we're doing here is we're thinking about I think in the costing terminology, they say cost elements, or what are some inputs that we need to estimate costs. Storage volume, sure. Energy cost, that's right. And we might call that a procurement cost of material or energy. That's right. Yeah, that's great. It's not only about what we're procuring directly, it's also about the outputs and cost to the waste. And in fact, that's an important one because that often doesn't come out of our budget. The base pays for that. So sometimes that can be easy to forget.
Another question. An earlier panelist made a distinction between price and cost.
Mm-hmm.
Are we making that distinction here?
That's also a really good question. This on the left side, we tend to use prices for the costing exercise when available. But then we also, so for example, for labor, we often use a fully burdened cost of labor. So it's there. Yeah, there's different ways to approach that, but yeah, with procurement, there would be a price. And then for other things like the indirect costs, you could use a cost approach. And then on the right, on the external costs, it would be a cost as opposed to a price. There's a lot more about that question specifically in department guidance on cost estimating. But yeah, it's not a simple answer.
Generally ignoring capital equipment and infrastructure.
So per department guidance, we are not, if you're doing a life cycle cost estimate, you estimate all costs that are logically attributed to your project. And this includes capital costs, which is not out of our budgets generally. And And so if you're trying to make a business case, it can be very convenient to leave out something like $1 million or $2 million new hangar that might be required to start up your process. But if you're doing a true life cycle cost estimate per DoD guidance, you're supposed to include that. Correct. You are supposed to include that. Okay. Labor as well. Jump to the, these are a few elements. These don't represent everything, but I did hear from the audience procurement costs. We have, and to your point, ma'am, it is a price there. Also, for indirect costs, we have things like the costs of PPE or hazardous waste or wastewater. And then we have what the department calls contingent costs. And these are a little bit trickier because these are potential future costs or liabilities. And these may be things like cleanup costs. And so one thing that's interesting about contingent costs is that you never present a contingent cost without a probability, because these are possible future costs. And then on the right, we have the social costs or the external costs. And that was what Dr. Lloyd was talking about with the life cycle assessment, human health, climate change, ecosystem quality. And
How do you talk about probability costs? How do you factor that in?
the probability for contingent costs. Ooh, that's.
I mean, I was saying like, okay, this is a 50% chance, so we're costing this at 50% of the maximum.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's domain specific. So there's not one definitive answer for how to quantify the probability. The general guidance is to include a probability, but then you get into the question of what specific kind of costs are you talking about. If you're in the cleanup space, it's probably going to look different than for readiness type of application.
So then, like, for the medical costs, would maybe insurance or liability or something along those lines?
Those are possible contingent costs. I am not an expert on contingent costs myself, so I don't know, Shannon, if you have further information there. Like I was saying before, they are domain specific, so there are multiple contingent cost categories, and oftentimes the life cycle cost estimates will not include many contingent costs unless there's one or two that are really probable for your application, and then there's specific guidance for those categories.
Government entity versus a company, right? I mean, that's things like.
Oh,
I don't know what they would.
oh, what they do in the private sector?
Well, no, I was gonna say, well, we had started, this is, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, we started using data from DoD data to specifically look at both the injuries, illnesses, and various other impacts to workers in different positions and with different types of exposure. And one of the things that was we started looking at is, can we actually track the costs, the long-term costs associated with those things, which is much, it's much easier to do within the DoD than within the private sector here, because with having, the VA, so you have more data. And so we didn't look at insurance costs. What we were looking at including was developing better methods to estimate the actual costs, not quality of life costs, not external costs, but the actual internal costs that the DoD might experience if these things happen to the workers in those positions. But that data set, because we started developing it years ago and it hasn't been developed any further, but it's definitely something that's interesting that could be done in the DoD because of the availability of data.
Well, there is a statutory requirement right now, and the Defense Health Agency is leading this to track impacts of
to soldiers or person. I was talking about. That one, thank you.
Yeah, that's for active duty, right? There's another one that's like cataloging every single thing. And
There's
something, I think there's things also doers or something like that.
Doors, yeah, as well. Yeah, oh my goodness, the occupational.
I don't know, the acronyms are a little overwhelming. Now I remember why I went to Canada academia to escape the acronyms of DoD.
All right.
All right, so we're gonna do one quick last exercise. We don't have a handout, I forgot about it. But we're gonna walk you through an example, not defense related, Canadian related. All right, so over the last few years, two of the students that I supervise, can you hit it again? I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had animation, weird animation. So I'm part of this Green Surface Engineering and Advanced Materials Network. It's a bunch of Canadian universities and a few other universities and industry partners. And one of the things that was baked into our grant is we have to do an LCA on every project. And so we work with the students who are doing the surface engineering research, and then we have LCA practitioner students, and they work closely together. And so one of our students, so in Canada, we really worry about water or other liquids freezing and bursting and causing lots of problems. And so believe it or not, lots of water pipes have these resistive heating cables wrapped around them so that everything doesn't freeze and cause damage. And so one of our students was developing a thermal spray pipe that had the resistive heating built in to replace that mess. And so next slide. So we did two studies. Well, he did many studies on his research, but we did two studies, not a surprise. We did the life cycle cost analysis first, and then we did the environmental life cycle assessment second. And the data for this, 80% of what was used here was used here. We just had a little bit of additional data. All right, so next slide. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how we did a, so remember I told you, you can do different levels of LCA. You can do a screening LCA. You can also do a very detailed LCA. We did a very detailed LCA. So we worked with the suppliers and we collected data about the specific materials that we were using. But we can do a screening LCA, and that's what I'm going to show you how to do using a defense input-output model. Again, available there. All right, next slide. Okay, so what we can do if you want to do a screening is, so we're using that image that we had before, but this is the upstream stuff, okay? It's the things that are being procured to make that pipe. And so we can do that with the defense input-output model pretty quickly and get a good screening level estimate of impacts. But then for the things that the operations and the manufacturing of it, we were manufacturing the pipe in our lab, and then we had a lab set up to what's the word I'm looking for, to set up a room to do the freezing so that we could monitor the performance of the pipes. And so we collected the data there on site. So that would be our process data, just like you would do. If you were going to be using something, you might capture the actual data associated with sustainment, but you would use the defense input output for all these upstream things. So now let's walk through that process. Okay, so this is the data from our study. You don't need to really pay attention to it. So we had information. We were looking at what would be the impacts to operate 5 meters of pipe for 10 years. Okay, and so this is the stuff from the LCA, and this is the data from the life cycle cost analysis. Both this one into the life cycle cost analysis. Some of it I had to estimate, so I couldn't find it in our reports, which made me think that I should have peer reviewed my own report. But anyway, so most of these are very accurate. A few of them are my best guess. Anyway, so we have this data. If you did the life cycle cost analysis, you would have all of this except for two things. You probably wouldn't know your carbon monoxide emissions or your water vapor emissions from this example, but everything else came from the cost analysis. So this is what we had to get in order to do the LCA. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so we get our totals. Next slide. All right, so first thing you do when you open the DIO model, we're going to look for the copper powder. We're just going to do that one item. So you go to what is called the NAICS lookup. And what this is it is a table in the scoring factor that has all of the detailed subsectors in every higher level makes industry sector. And so you can search. So I went in, I searched metal powder, because it's thermal free, we have 3 layers. We have 3 different materials that we're using in those layers. I just decided I'm gonna look for the metal powder, the copper. So I looked up, I found metal powder and flake made from purchased copper. So that's the sector that I'm looking for. You want to look here because we don't have everything at the most detailed level in the scoring factors, because we use data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they don't have the data for the industry transactions at the most detailed level. So you find out which code, 331420. That's what I want. Okay, so now let's go to the score. Oh, I want to make one other point. If this is a little bit cumbersome to look through, if you want a better resource, we have this site here, www.census.gov, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you go there and you can search for anything. And not only does it bring up these categories, but it has paragraphs explaining what's in them. And so you search for some really weird material, you'll very well find it there. So if you can't find it here, go there and search. All right, find the NAICS code. Next slide. Then you go back to the scoring factors worksheet in the scoring factors workbook, and you look for, okay, it was 331420, or 0 is always get dropped off. Just want to let you know, that's one thing that's really weird about NAICS code sometimes, is that you lose your zeros. So 331420, this is the parent industry sector for that one that we just found. Copper, rolling, drawing, screening, and alloying. That's what we want. All right, so then next slide, we scroll over. You don't know this, but it's the same row. We scroll over and we say, what's the inventory item unit? What that tells us is we're going to get the environmental impact per unit something. So it's either going to be in US dollars, or it's going to be in kilograms or pounds, depending on what it is. So when we go to the carbon monoxide, it would be in units of mass. But when we're looking at the industry sectors, it's in units of dollars. So it says, okay, I have to know in 2014 US dollars. In this example, we're going to assume everything's in 2014 dollars. But I have to know my values in 2014 dollars. And we have instructions in the guidance, if you have your dollars in a different order, how to convert them to 2014, it's very simple. But anyway, so we find this, okay, lock it in for US dollar. Okay, let's scroll over more. Go, Michael. All right, we scrolled more, and now we get to the endpoints. So we have resource availability, climate change, human health, environmental quality, and external cost. So I say, oh, so for every 2014 dollar, that's the value I need for my copper powder. All right, so then I just multiply. All right, go to our next slide. Woo, okay, so this is the end of that table that I had before, where I had each of the things that were inputs to the pipe that I was manufacturing or using to prevent my pipes from freezing. And this was the copper powder. Remember, I had $9.39 for my 5 meters of pipe. And now I have each of I didn't put the external cost. I have the impact value. So the resource availability in megajoules extra, climate change and CO2 equivalent. So now you just do this for all of them, for each of your alternatives, and you can compare and contrast them, and that's a good screening LCA. See, just an LCA.
Hey.
How is that human health number determined? It is determined using a bunch of models that have been peer reviewed and developed by researchers that develop what are called life cycle impact assessment methods. And what those methods do is they look at, so there are some that are sort of just globally generic, and then there are some that are developed for specific locations. This model was developed for the US. No, this model was a global one.
I have to look at it varies for each category. It's in the guide. I have to go back. And
so, well, climate change is a global model, regardless. CO2 emission is a CO2 emission is a CO2 emission, regardless of where it occurs. But and resource availability is global. Human health is usually done on a regional level. So regional could be the US, it could be Europe. We have very big regions in our life cycle assessment models. And environmental quality as well.
So is it like fatalities? Is it a cancer?
Oh, I'm sorry, that is
disability adjusted life year.
Sorry, I didn't know what you were asking about. Yeah, so it is. So we, remember this is the midpoint and the endpoint. In the midpoint, we look at every category and we have a method for comparing each of the flows for that mechanism. Then we take everything to these endpoints. And so anything that contributes to human health is converted to disability adjusted life here, which is a measure of reduced quality of life. We could do a whole class on this. I would love to. We could go through each one of these. We have the details in the sustainability announcement if you want to get into it. But really our goal is to make it, is to provide a tool that's relatively straightforward to use and is robust and has been peer, every method that it uses has been peer reviewed.
These emissions are often also called embodied emissions, and they incorporate the emissions from the life cycle of the products and the upstream. And with respect to human health category, this is damages to human health in the environment from emissions to the environment, not the occupational setting.
Like more like EPA sort of public exposure levels.
And in fact, the data for the flows are in the model largely come from EPA, Department of Energy. And yeah, and once again, that's why the social costs, and we emphasized earlier that, yeah, these are costs to society, but hence is Shannon's point earlier to one of the PIs about also taking into account occupational exposure.
Whoever has the mic gets to talk. That's how we get our house and dinner table.
Thank you. Curious about this LCA in particular, when all said and done, did the team take a look back at the results and like we can produce impact here, and if that materialized?
Well, the interesting thing about this study was, so there's a couple of things. One is we did a bunch of scenario analyses and we looked at, so the provinces have very different electricity mixes. And so the putting the powders under the pipe, there's definitely more occupational issues associated with that process as opposed to the cable process. So when it comes down to the end, essentially the choice is, if you're going to be in an area, I should mention that the thermally sprayed pipe is about 30% more energy efficient than the cables. And so if you're going to be in an area where you're already using low carbon emissions, it's better to use the old technology. If you're going to be in any of the provinces other than Quebec, where there's a lot more non-renewable energy, then it's better to use the thermally sprayed pipe. But the other thing that we did is we identified, for the research that I was developing, we identified a variety of areas where they could reduce the impact of the production of the pipe. And so he's actually now a professor. We're very excited when that happens. In Evansville, actually. And he's doing research now to try to reduce the thickness of the coating layers. One layer, two, I can't remember off the top of my head which one was the one that was the most important one to reduce. And so he's working on that. So not only do we identify when we should use each of these alternatives, we also identify, well, what needs to be done to this new technology to make it more environmentally preferred in all cases.
Actually, I'm sorry about that. When you get the number, what this number means, we saw some vulnerabilities and what's the 18.1, what it means, MJ action.
Well, so I think standing with LCA, any one of these numbers alone is not that interesting, right? So, and it's not that important to understand. Again, this means the kilograms of CO2 equivalent, right? This means the disability adjusted life years. It has a meaning on and of its own, but it's really not interesting to look at on its own. When it becomes interesting, where are you going?
I was going to go to an example with a comparison.
Yeah, so when it becomes interesting is when you can do two things. One, compare alternatives, as you did earlier. So then we can see what the difference is between the alternatives. So we can see where we are now and where these alternatives would get us. So that's one thing to do. The other thing, as I mentioned, is figuring out what's driving impacts. And it's often surprising. We often have this idea that we know. In some cases we do. If you have a product that's using energy in the use phase, that energy consumption generally has a big impact on overall environmental impact. But sometimes we don't know. So for example, with the thermal, the coating, the researcher that was working on it would never have known that one of those coatings had a much higher impact than the others. And so when we compare, we used to look at, basically we often look at all of the process materials and everything that's come in and out of the system, you know, side by side. Let's look at, well, what's driving impact in each of these categories. And so that's what you saw. I think the main thing to remember is LCA is a useful tool for making relative comparisons.
Is there a resource that I could look at to say, here's LCAs that are done? Like if I want to compare my new process and product to an existing process and product, has there been an LCA done for that already?
Yes, maybe. So there's a bunch of resources. The main problem is that people often don't publish the level of detail that you need to make a comparison. So what we find in a lot of studies is that, you know, you can't, there's the published studies, but there's several data sets. So EcoInvent is a database that has a lot of data for, you know, many different types of welding, for example. So if you have some sort of new welding process, you can look at these various types of welding processes, and that's very detailed data. There's a what is it called? CROT in Germany.
We get Gabby too.
But yeah, well, Gabby does too. But there's OpenLCA. OpenLCA is a software tool, but the person who developed it also created a database of available data sets. And so you can go into that tool, and it's not called OpenLCA, but you go to OpenLCA, select on the thing that says data, it'll get you to this resource, and you can type in, you know, some keywords of what you're looking for, and it'll find the data sets. Now, some of those data sets will be for fee data sets, and then some will be published.
There is a federal initiative. It's called the Federal Lifecycle Commons, or and also the Federal LCI, which are resources. So the Federal LCA Commons is an interagency technical working group that collaborates on data development, and they have the common lifecycle inventory data that's publicly available on the website for use by the public. And the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, EPA are big contributors to the federal commons.
Michael, does the DNX have a link to the federal commons?
No, that's a good idea.
I would ask Michael if he needs the federal commons.
Yeah.
How specific do those codes get, and can we utilize them for, like, say, an example might be like chromium or hexavalent chromium versus molybdenum or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So for some commodity materials that are used at a large scale and you do have specificity, they have their own individual code. When you get to specialty materials, so there's, you know, it's not for the Bureau BEA.
Bureau Economic Analysis.
Yeah, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, doesn't make sense for them to create detailed information for all of those sectors so they can bump together. It's a big problem. So this is one of those situations where if there are materials, when we start to, so one thing I should mention is that there is process-specific data within the DIO, as we mentioned before. So for example, for weapon systems, if you're operating weapon systems, there's data on those specific weapon systems, the amount of fuel we're getting, things like that. So I think for DoD, the next step should be to figure out where do we want more detailed process data and for what? And is it certain chemicals that are used in sustainment? Are they certain materials that are used in the production of our annual sustainment? Is it building materials? And then you can get more specific. So this is a screening. If you want a detailed LCA, then you're going to have to capture that data or develop tools that have that information for you. Now, with that said, there are databases that do have data for these materials. Some of them are publicly available, and if so, I think that they should be incorporated in the DIO. And the ones that are not publicly available, then we're kind of like what.
And to build to that, the department guidance is to do what's called a hybrid life cycle assessment, where you use this information to estimate supply chain emissions, but then create further detail with process information that's available. So you might be able to start answering some of those questions for the specialty materials as part of your specific project. And
It's actually probably an improvement we should have made to this last exercise, is that your first step should be to search to see if we have process data for it. And then if you don't have process data, then you go to the industry data.
yeah, right. We're at time. So thank you so much for attending the short course. We did miss one briefing from Dr. Wes Ingwerson from EPA. He had a brief on tools available from the Environmental Protection Agency to conduct these kinds of analyses. We collaborate often with the EPA Office of Research and Development, and there are various tools that are available. He did record his presentation, so we'll see if we can find a way to make that available later. All right, thank you.